The story of Zoroastrianism begins in the landscapes of ancient Iran, where mountains, plateaus and deserts framed the life of early peoples who built their societies in constant negotiation with a harsh but sustaining environment. These early Iranians were not isolated wanderers, but part of a broader network of Indo-Iranian cultures that stretched across the steppes, carrying with them traditions of ritual, sacrifice, and reverence for forces of nature that they considered divine. Long before the teachings of Zarathustra, the people of this land developed religious practices that revolved around fire, water, and sky, viewing them not simply as natural elements, but as entities with spiritual authority. Archaeological evidence from settlements dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE provides glimpses into these traditions. Sites such as Tepe Nush-i Jan, Godin Tepe, and Tureng Tepe reveal fire altars, ceremonial vessels, and sacred enclosures that point to the centrality of ritual purity and controlled offerings. These structures and their associated artifacts suggest that even before Zoroastrianism crystallized into a distinct faith, the groundwork for a religion centered on cosmic order and elemental sanctity was already in place. Linguistic and comparative studies of the Indo-Iranian languages also provide insight into these early beliefs. The Rig Veda, composed by Indo-Aryan groups to the east, and the Avesta, the later sacred text of the Zoroastrians, share cognate deities and concepts. Terms such as Asura in the Vedic tradition and Ahura in the Iranian, both signifying divine beings, reflect a shared heritage. Similarly, the idea of Rita in the Vedas and Asha in Iranian thought both signify truth, order, and the moral alignment of the universe. Over time, these shared ideas diverged as Iranian religious culture developed its own identity. Deities revered as benevolent in India often took on darker roles in Iranian belief, while others rose in prominence as defenders of cosmic truth. This reversal illustrates the gradual evolution of a unique religious framework among the early Iranian peoples, one that set the stage for the eventual teachings of Zarathustra. By the 2nd millennium BCE, Iranian tribes had spread widely across the plateau. They brought with them pastoral traditions that emphasized the importance of cattle, horses, and cultivated grains, and they developed social structures that bound clans together under chiefs and priests. Religion was not a separate sphere, but interwoven with governance, warfare, and agriculture. Priests supervised sacrifices, chanting hymns that invoke the favour of the gods for fertility, rain, and protection in battle. The act of sacrifice, involving offerings of meat and libations, was not merely symbolic, but understood as a direct exchange with divine beings. Fire was used to carry offerings upward, its smoke reaching the unseen powers who watched over the community. These practices reveal a religious landscape that was already deeply ritualized and oriented toward maintaining harmony between human activity and cosmic forces. It is within this cultural environment that Zarathustra, later known to the Greeks as Zoroaster, would emerge. But before his life and reforms, it is essential to understand how the Iranian conception of divinity was already leaning toward a dualistic structure. The evidence suggests that among the deities of the Proto-Iranian pantheon, there existed a tension between forces associated with truth, light, and order, and others aligned with deception, darkness, and destruction. This polarity foreshadowed the central doctrine of Zoroastrianism. Early hymns and ritual inscriptions point to divine beings who upheld the cosmic order, and to others who were seen as malevolent or disruptive. The moral colouring of the pantheon distinguished the Iranians from some of their neighbours, indicating that their spirituality was increasingly tied not just to natural phenomena, but to ethical principles. Archaeological and textual records provide further evidence for the shaping of Iranian religion in this formative period. Excavations at Bactria and Margiana, regions at the northeastern edge of the Iranian plateau, reveal temples and ritual structures that contained fire altars and vessels decorated with images of winged beings, plant motifs, and solar symbols. These artifacts suggest complex ceremonies, possibly involving intoxicating substances, music and recitations aimed at entering states of communion with divine powers. Scholars have linked some of these practices to the later use of hauma, a sacred drink mentioned in both the Avesta and the Rigveda, indicating continuity across centuries. The preparation and consumption of hauma were seen as acts that conferred strength, health, and divine favour, bridging the human and the supernatural. As Iranian tribes organised into larger political entities, their religious practices also became more institutionalised. Leaders patronised rituals that affirm their legitimacy, aligning themselves with divine sanction. The very concept of kingship among the early Iranians was bound up with the idea that rulers held authority not merely by force, but by virtue of cosmic order. This belief in a divinely sanctioned rulership would later become central to Zoroastrianism's role in empires, especially under the Achaemenids and Sasanians. In the earliest phases, however, it manifested in ceremonies where chiefs and kings made offerings on behalf of their people, reinforcing their position as mediators between humanity and the divine. The geographical setting of Iran itself played a formative role in shaping these religious ideas. The Iranian plateau, with its extreme climates, demanded constant adaptation and awareness of natural cycles. Water was scarce in many regions, making rivers, springs and wells precious and often sacralized. Fire, whether in the hearth or the ritual altar, represented both protection and transformation, a living presence that connected earthly life with heavenly forces. The sun, blazing across the open skies, became a symbol of truth and life-giving power. Mountains rising above the plains were seen as seats of divine presence, places where heaven and earth met. This deep sacralization of the environment explains why Zoroastrianism, even in its mature form, placed such emphasis on the elements as bearers of purity and as channels of divine truth. Texts from later centuries preserve faint echoes of myths that likely originated in this early period. Stories of primordial battles between gods and demons, of the shaping of the world by divine craftsman figures, and of the destiny of the soul after death, all point to a religious imagination already fertile with themes that Zoroastrianism would develop in systematic form. The idea that life was a battleground between order and chaos, truth and lie, seems to have been embedded in Iranian consciousness long before Zarathustra. His significance would lie not in creating these concepts from nothing, but in giving them a new clarity and focus that reshaped the trajectory of Iranian religion. The economic and social structures of early Iranian communities also reinforced religious practices. Herding societies emphasized communal bonds, with rituals performed collectively for the benefit of clans. Agricultural practices demanded attention to seasonal cycles, aligning rituals with planting and harvest times. Warfare, frequent among tribal groups, was sacralized through ceremonies that invoked divine aid and celebrated victory as a sign of cosmic favor. Even personal conduct was framed in religious terms. Truthfulness, loyalty, and courage were valued not merely as social virtues but as alignments with the cosmic order. To lie or to betray was not simply immoral, it was an act that strengthened the forces of chaos and deceit. This moral framing of everyday life contributed to the profound ethical dimension of Zoroastrianism. In examining the wider context of the Near East during this period, it is clear that the Iranians were not developing in isolation. Contacts with Mesopotamia, Elam, and later with the peoples of Central Asia and the Indus Valley exposed them to diverse religious influences. From Mesopotamia came ideas of divine assemblies and fate-decreeing gods. From Elam and the highlands of Iran came traditions of mountain sanctuaries and fertility cults. These interactions enriched the Iranian religious landscape, even as it retained its distinct dualistic tendencies. The balance between adopting external influences and preserving internal traditions shaped the character of early Iranian spirituality, making it both cosmopolitan and uniquely its own. The emergence of writing systems in neighbouring regions allowed some of these early traditions to be documented indirectly. Though much of what we know about pre-Zoroastrian religion comes from later reconstructions and archaeological interpretation, still the continuity between the earliest fire altars, the sacredness of water, and the later elaborate doctrines of Zoroastrianism provides strong evidence that the roots of the faith reach deep into prehistory. This continuity also explains why Zoroastrianism, once codified, felt so natural to its adherents, as it aligned with long-standing traditions that had guided their ancestors for centuries. When Zarathustra appeared, he would not emerge into a vacuum but into a religious world already alive with rituals, deities, and ethical concerns. His genius would be to sharpen these into a coherent doctrine centered on one supreme god, Ahura Mazda, and on the ethical responsibility of each individual to choose truth over lies. The background of fire worship, elemental sanctity, and moral dualism provided the soil in which his teachings would take root, without the centuries of ritual practice and mythological development that preceded him. Zoroastrianism could not have assumed the form that it did. The early Iranian religious framework thus represents both continuity and transformation. Continuity, because the elements and ethical concerns that shaped the lives of the tribes remained central to their spirituality across generations. Transformation, because under the guidance of reformers and prophets, these elements were reorganized into a system that would not only define a people, but influence world religions across millennia. From this dawn of belief in sacred fire, holy water, and cosmic truth, the stage was set for the voice of Zarathustra to resonate, reshaping ancient traditions into a faith that carried both simplicity and profound depth. The figure at the centre of this tradition is Zarathustra, known in later Greek sources as Zoroaster, a man whose name and message would become inseparable from the religion that carried his voice across empires and centuries. His origins remain veiled in uncertainty, with scholarly debates extending from the late 2nd millennium BCE to the early 1st millennium BCE. But what is clear is that he emerged from the Iranian world at a time when its spiritual landscape was filled with rituals, sacrifices, and a pantheon of deities presiding over every aspect of life. In this setting, Zarathustra's vision presented a decisive break, not by denying the sacredness of fire, water, and sky that his people revered, but by reorganizing these elements under the supremacy of one god, Ahura Mazda, and by demanding from every individual a moral choice that would align them with truth or with the lie. The combination of inherited ritual practices and his radical interpretation created a new path for Iranian religion, one that would prove durable enough to survive political upheavals and resonate far beyond the land of its birth. The biographical details of Zarathustra's life come to us primarily through the Gathas, a collection of hymns attributed directly to him, embedded within the Avesta. These hymns are written in an archaic form of the Avestan language and display a poetic structure that was meant to be recited and remembered in ritual settings. Within these hymns, Zarathustra speaks of his struggles, his revelations, and his relationship with Ahura Mazda. They provide glimpses into a man who faced resistance from his community, who debated with priests loyal to older rituals, and who proclaimed a message that sought to replace ritual excess with ethical clarity. In these verses, he describes himself as a seeker of truth, as one called by divine wisdom to guide others toward the path of righteousness, and as someone who endured hardship to spread a teaching that was at once simple in its core and immense in its cosmic implications. Later traditions, preserved in Middle Persian texts composed centuries after his time, provide narratives that fill in the gaps of his biography. These accounts describe him as born into a priestly family, trained in the rituals of his time, and yet dissatisfied with their complexity and corruption. They recount that at the age of 30 he received a divine revelation by a river, when he encountered Vohu Mana, the spirit of good mind, who led him into the presence of Ahura Mazda and the other Amesha Spentus, the beneficent immortals who embody aspects of divine wisdom. In this vision, Zarathustra is said to have realized that Ahura Mazda is the supreme creator, the source of all truth, and the opponent of Achaemenid, the destructive spirit whose purpose is to spread deceit and disorder. From this encounter his mission began, to proclaim the supremacy of Ahura Mazda, to teach that human beings are participants in a cosmic struggle, and to insist that salvation lies in choosing Asha, the truth, over Druj, the lie. What distinguishes Zarathustra's teaching from the religious environment in which he lived is its focus on ethical decision-making. Whereas earlier rituals emphasize sacrifices to many gods, often with elaborate offerings of animals and intoxicating substances, Zarathustra condemned such practices as corrupt and unnecessary. He rejected the notion that divine favour could be bought with ritual display, insisting instead that the highest form of worship was to live a life aligned with truth, honesty, and righteousness. His critique of ritual slaughter, particularly of cattle, set him apart from the priestly establishment of his time, many of whom depended on such sacrifices for their livelihood. This opposition contributed to the resistance he faced in spreading his message, as entrenched religious authorities and community leaders saw his teachings as a direct challenge to their power. Central to his doctrine was the dualism between Ahura Mazda and Achaemenid, a polarity that defined the cosmos not as a neutral field, but as a battleground between truth and falsehood, light and darkness, creation and destruction. Yet Zarathustra's dualism was not one of equal powers. He insisted that Ahura Mazda was supreme, the ultimate creator of the universe, and that Achaemenid's destructive efforts, though powerful, were destined to fail. Human beings, however, occupied a crucial position in this struggle. By their thoughts, words, and deeds, they could align themselves with either side, strengthening the forces of truth or empowering the spread of the lie. This moral responsibility transformed religion from a collective ritual system into a personal and ethical commitment, giving every individual a direct role in the fate of the cosmos. The ethical teachings of Zarathustra are encapsulated in the triad of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. This simple formula condensed the essence of his message, providing a guide for daily conduct that extended beyond ritual observance into every aspect of life. To think truthfully, to speak truthfully, and to act truthfully were the paths by which one served Ahura Mazda and resisted Achaemenid. This moral framework penetrated deeply into Iranian culture, shaping not only religious devotion, but social relationships, legal practices, and concepts of governance. In the Gathas, Zarathustra prays for rulers who govern with righteousness, condemns those who lead with deception, and envisions a society where justice is guided by divine truth rather than by force or corruption. His vision was both spiritual and political, offering an ideal that could sustain communities and empires alike. The role of the Amesha Spentus, the immortal benefactors, added structure to Zarathustra's cosmology. These divine beings, emanations of Ahura Mazda, represented aspects of creation and ethical principles. Vohu Mana embodied good mind and compassion, Asha Vahishta represented truth and cosmic order, Kshatra Vairya stood for desirable dominion and just rule, Spenta Amiti signified devotion and humility, Havatat symbolized wholeness and health, and Ameritat embodied immortality. Together they formed a framework through which humans could understand and participate in the divine order. By cultivating these virtues, believers aligned themselves with Ahura Mazda's will. Zarathustra's emphasis on these principles shifted religious focus away from appeasing unpredictable deities and toward embodying consistent ethical values. Despite the clarity of his vision, Zarathustra's path was not easy. His hymns describe him as mocked, opposed, and even threatened by his own community. The priests who maintained the older sacrificial system resisted his rejection of animal offerings and intoxicating rituals. Warriors and rulers who sought divine sanction for conquest found little support in his teachings, which emphasized righteousness and protection of the innocent. For years, it is said, he wandered, preaching his message to those who would listen, gathering only a small number of followers. His breakthrough came when he secured the support of a powerful patron, often identified as King Vishtaspa, who embraced his teachings and established them as the foundation of his court's religious practice. With royal support, Zarathustra's message gained stability, spreading beyond isolated communities to become a structured faith capable of sustaining large political entities. The transformation of his teachings into the guiding ideology of kingdoms marked a turning point in Iranian history. Under the patronage of Vishtaspa and others who followed, Zoroastrianism began to develop institutions, priesthoods, and texts that would carry it forward. The hymns of Zarathustra, memorized and recited by his followers, formed the earliest layer of the Avesta, while subsequent generations expanded the corpus with additional liturgical and legal texts. The emphasis on truth, cosmic order, and ethical responsibility remained central, but the religion also adapted to the practical needs of governance and community life, incorporating rituals, laws, and doctrines that extended beyond the prophet's original hymns. Zarathustra's vision of the afterlife reinforced the moral weight of his teachings. He taught that the soul, upon death, would cross the Chinvat Bridge, a passage that separated the world of the living from the realm beyond. For those who had lived in truth, the bridge widened, leading them safely into the House of Song, a realm of light and joy in the presence of Ahura Mazda. For those who had lived in lies, the bridge narrowed, casting them into the House of Deceit, a place of darkness and torment. This eschatological framework ensured that moral choices carried eternal consequences, strengthening the urgency of ethical living. It also provided comfort to the oppressed and a warning to the powerful, making clear that earthly status would not shield anyone from divine judgment. The universality of Zarathustra's message is striking when compared to the particularism of many ancient religions. He did not preach to a single tribe or ethnic group alone, but to humanity as a whole, insisting that the struggle between truth and lie encompassed all peoples. This universality allowed Zoroastrianism to spread across diverse communities and to adapt to the changing political landscapes of empires. At the same time, its emphasis on personal responsibility made it adaptable to individuals in every social role, from king to farmer, from warrior to artisan. The balance between universal scope and personal obligation contributed to its resilience as a religion that could endure through centuries of upheaval. The teachings of Zarathustra thus represent both continuity with the religious traditions of his ancestors and a profound reform that reshaped them into a coherent ethical system. His focus on Ahura Mazda as supreme creator, on the Amesha-Spentas as embodiments of divine wisdom, on the cosmic struggle between truth and lie, and on the moral responsibility of every individual provided a foundation that would guide Iranian religion for millennia. His rejection of ritual excess, his insistence on ethical conduct, and his vision of judgment and afterlife transformed the way his followers understood their place in the cosmos. The legacy of his life and teaching cannot be measured only by their immediate impact, for their true significance lies in the way they prepared the ground for the integration of Zoroastrianism into the political and cultural structures of great empires. What began as the hymns of a solitary prophet wandering through hostile communities would, within centuries, become the guiding faith of rulers whose dominion stretched across vast territories, shaping law, governance, and identity. The simplicity of his core message, choose truth over lie, choose good over evil, choose life over destruction, resonated across generations, carried by priests, kings, and communities who found in it both spiritual guidance and social order. At the heart of Zarathustra's teaching stands the tension between two opposing realities, embodied by Ahura Mazda and Achaemenid, whose struggle defines the cosmos and gives meaning to every human decision. In this system, the universe is not an endless cycle of creation and destruction, as imagined by other traditions, nor is it the playground of capricious deities who shift allegiances at will. Instead, it is a battleground structured by moral polarity, where truth and falsehood, life and death, order and chaos confront each other with ultimate consequences. The presence of these two principles in Zarathustra's vision provided not only a framework for understanding the natural and moral world, but also a way of interpreting history, human conduct, and destiny itself. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, was proclaimed by Zarathustra as the supreme creator, the source of all that is good, true, and enduring. In the Gathas, Zarathustra addresses him as the father of Asha, the principle of truth and order that governs the cosmos. He is portrayed as omniscient, benevolent, and aligned with justice, a being whose very essence is wisdom. Unlike the gods of polytheistic pantheons, who often display human weaknesses and conflicting interests, Ahura Mazda stands apart as a deity of perfect consistency, incapable of deceit, devoted only to the preservation and promotion of truth. His role as creator is not limited to the physical universe, but extends to moral law, ensuring that the very structure of reality reflects ethical principles. Light, fire, sun, and the clarity of mind are all expressions of his nature, providing humanity with tangible signs of his presence in daily life. Opposed to him is Achaemenid, the hostile spirit, whose essence is deception, violence, and corruption. Achaemenid is not merely a mischievous trickster, but the embodiment of the lie, the force that distorts creation, brings disease, foments discord, and undermines truth. In Zarathustra's vision, Achaemenid is not a co-creator, equal in power to Ahura Mazda, but a destructive spirit who chooses opposition to the good. His defining characteristic is free will misapplied, for in Zoroastrian teaching even spiritual beings have the ability to choose between truth and lie. Achaemenid's choice was rebellion against order, a rejection of wisdom in favour of deceit, and in that choice he became the adversary not only of Ahura Mazda, but of humanity, whose moral struggle is bound up with his schemes. This dualism did not mean that the world was conceived as a static division between two eternal and equally matched powers. Zarathustra's hymns emphasize that Ahura Mazda is destined to triumph, that truth will ultimately overcome falsehood, and that the work of creation, though contested, will not be undone. Yet the reality of Achaemenid's activity gives weight to human existence, for every individual becomes a participant in this cosmic battle through the decisions they make. To think a false thought, to utter a lie, to commit an unjust deed is not merely a personal failing, but an act that strengthens Achaemenid's hand in the struggle. Conversely, every act of honesty, every word spoken in truth, every deed aligned with justice is a contribution to Ahura Mazda's ultimate victory. This conception placed an extraordinary responsibility on each person, elevating daily choices into acts of cosmic significance. The theology of dualism also provided explanations for the suffering and disorder that people observed in the world around them. Where some traditions attributed disease, famine, and conflict to the unpredictable will of the gods, Zoroastrianism saw them as the work of Achaemenid and his demons, spiritual forces aligned with him in opposition to creation. These entities, known as Daivas, were considered false gods, deceivers who lured humans into destructive practices and corrupted rituals. In rejecting sacrifice to the Daivas, Zarathustra and his followers positioned themselves against traditions that had long dominated Iranian religion, setting up a stark division between those who worshipped in truth and those who perpetuated falsehood. This polarization of deities into beneficent and malevolent categories was one of the most distinctive features of Zoroastrianism, shaping not only its theology, but its ethical worldview. The concept of Asha, truth and order, provided the key to understanding Ahura Mazda's nature. Asha was not simply a moral ideal, but the very structure of reality, the principle by which the universe operated. To live according to Asha was to align oneself with creation, to be in harmony with the cosmic order established by the wise Lord. The opposite of Asha was Druj, the lie, which Angra sought to spread. Druj was disorder, deception, and corruption, a force that undermined both the physical and the moral worlds. The conflict between Asher and Druj extended to every sphere of life, to agriculture, where fertile fields represented Asher and blighted crops represented Druj, to health, where wholeness and vitality were Asher and disease and decay were Druj, to society where justice and honesty reflected Asher and tyranny and falsehood reflected Druj. This ethical cosmology made every aspect of existence a site of struggle between the two principles, ensuring that no action was morally neutral. The Amesha Spentus, emanations of Ahura Mazda, further illustrated this dualism by embodying aspects of creation that stood in direct opposition to the corruptions of Angra. For every force of wholeness there was a corresponding corruption, for every virtue a vice. Water, sacred and life-giving under Halvatat, could be polluted by Angra influence, becoming a source of disease. Earth, sanctified under Spenta Ameti, could be defiled by lies and violence. Fire, pure and illuminating under Ashavahishta, could be extinguished or misused in destructive ways. These contrasts reinforced the idea that the world was contested territory, that creation itself was under assault, and that vigilance was necessary to preserve purity and truth. This dualistic theology was not merely speculative, but had practical implications for ritual and daily life. Because the forces of Angra were believed to spread through pollution and disorder, Zoroastrian practice emphasized purity in thought, word, and deed, as well as in physical surroundings. Fire temples were carefully tended to ensure that the sacred flame remained undefiled, symbolizing the unbroken presence of Ahura Mazda's truth in the world. Water sources were protected, with rituals ensuring that they were kept clean and free from contamination. Burial practices were shaped by this concern, leading to the use of exposure in towers of silence rather than burial or cremation, to avoid polluting earth or fire with corpses, which were considered vulnerable to Druj. In this way, theology and practice were intimately linked, with dualism informing not only beliefs, but every detail of religious observance. The eschatological dimension of dualism gave Zoroastrianism a distinctive outlook on history. Rather than seeing time as an endless repetition of cycles, Zarathustra and his successors taught that history was a linear process moving toward a final resolution. Angra power was real but temporary, and a day would come when he would be defeated, when truth would prevail, and when creation would be renewed in perfection. This expectation of a final triumph infused daily life with hope, reminding believers that their struggles were not in vain but part of a larger narrative moving toward justice. The anticipation of the Saoshyant, a saviour figure who would appear at the end of time to lead humanity into the final victory, reinforced this forward-looking vision, making Zoroastrianism one of the earliest religions to articulate a doctrine of history with a definite end and purpose. Greek and later classical writers, encountering Zoroastrianism through the Persians, were struck by this dualistic system. They often interpreted Ahura Mazda as a supreme god, akin to Zeus and Angra as a principle of evil resembling the later Christian conception of Satan. Though such comparisons are not exact, they illustrate how foreign observers recognize the uniqueness of Zoroastrian dualism. In a world where many religions accepted the coexistence of benevolent and malevolent gods without clear moral divisions, the sharp distinction between truth and lie, good and evil, in Zarathustra's teaching appeared revolutionary. This conceptual clarity would later influence Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought, contributing to their own notions of a cosmic struggle between God and Satan, righteousness and sin, salvation and damnation. The endurance of this dualistic vision across centuries owes much to its adaptability. While Ahura Mazda remained supreme, later Zoroastrian traditions elaborated on Angra role, sometimes portraying him as an independent principle of evil, sometimes as a rebellious spirit within creation. debates among Zoroastrian theologians explored the precise nature of his existence, his origin, and his eventual fate. Yet these variations did not diminish the central truth of the teaching, that life was a battlefield of moral choices, that truth and lie confronted each other in every action, and that humanity's role was decisive in the outcome. This conviction sustained communities through hardship, conquest, and dispersion, reminding them that even in defeat or exile, their choices still mattered in the cosmic balance. The dualism of Ahura Mazda and Achaemenid also provided a framework for law and governance in societies influenced by Zoroastrianism. Kings and rulers were expected to govern in alignment with Asher, upholding justice, protecting the weak, and promoting honesty. Corrupt rulers were not merely political failures, but seen as servants of Druj, allies of Achaemenid. This perspective gave religious sanction to resistance against tyranny and reinforced the moral dimension of political authority. In legal codes and royal inscriptions, references to truth, justice, and the protection of creation echo Zarathustra's vision, demonstrating how dualism permeated not only personal piety but public life. In daily devotion, believers addressed Ahura Mazda as the source of wisdom and protector against the snares of Achaemenid. Prayers invoked the Amesha Spentus to strengthen virtues and to shield against corruption. Ritual purity was maintained not out of superstition, but as a practical resistance against the spread of Druj. Every meal, every oath, every contract carried moral weight, for truth was the measure of legitimacy, and falsehood was a sign of Achaemenid's influence. The presence of the sacred flame in temples and homes reminded believers that light dispels darkness, that truth exposes lies, and that Ahura Mazda's wisdom was always available to those who sought it with sincerity. The enduring power of this dualism lies in its clarity and its moral demand. By framing the universe as a contest between truth and lie, Zarathustra's teaching left no room for indifference. Neutrality was itself a choice, and to refuse to act for truth was to strengthen the lie. This insistence on decision gave human life a seriousness that few other ancient religions conveyed. Every act became part of a larger story. Every word spoken had cosmic significance. Every thought carried weight in the balance of the universe. It is this sense of moral gravity, combined with the assurance of eventual triumph, that sustained Zoroastrian communities across generations, making their faith one of the most resilient and influential in human history. Among the defining features of Zoroastrianism is the sanctity accorded to the natural elements, most especially fire, but also water, earth, and air, each considered not only essential to life, but manifestations of divine presence and order. This focus was not an invention of Zarathustra's teaching in isolation, but a development from earlier Iranian practices that venerated natural forces as divine. Yet under his reforms, these elements were reinterpreted in the light of Ahura Mazda's supremacy and the struggle between Asher and Druj, truth and lie. They ceased to be mere objects of worship and became symbols of purity, channels through which divine order could be experienced and maintained. The reverence for elements shaped ritual practice, daily life, and the very architecture of Zoroastrian communities, ensuring that their presence remained central across centuries and regions. Fire held the most exalted position among these elements, both as a physical phenomenon and as a symbol. To the Zoroastrians, fire was the visible embodiment of Asher, the order and truth of creation. Its light dispelled darkness, its warmth sustained life, and its transformative power mirrored the action of wisdom in shaping reality. In the Gathas, Zarathustra refers to fire as the son of Ahura Mazda, not in a literal genealogical sense, but as a metaphor for its inseparable connection with divine wisdom. Every flame, or whether in a hearth, a lamp, or an altar, represented the presence of the wise Lord. To maintain fire was to maintain truth itself, to protect it from defilement, was to guard the boundary between order and chaos. For this reason, Zoroastrian rituals revolved around the tending of sacred fires, with priests carefully feeding them pure fuel, shielding them from contamination, and ensuring that they burned continuously. The establishment of fire temples became a hallmark of Zoroastrian practice. These structures, found in archaeological remains from Achaemenid through Sasanian times, and continuing into the present, were designed around the central chamber where the sacred flame was kept. The fire, burning in a bronze or clay vessel, was tended day and night by priests who observed strict purity laws to prevent any pollution. The surrounding architecture often included halls for communal gathering, spaces for ritual preparation, and enclosures to protect the fire from wind and dust. The hierarchy of fires developed over time, with some temples maintaining a tashdadga, ordinary household-level fires, while others enshrined a tashadaran, fires representing clans or districts, and the highest grade, a tashbehram, consecrated through elaborate ceremonies involving the purification and unification of fires drawn from diverse sources. These distinctions reflect both theological significance and the social organisation of Zoroastrian communities, where fire symbolised unity and continuity across families, regions and empires. Water, though less visible in ritual spaces, was equally sacred. In the Iranian plateau, where rivers and springs sustained agriculture and survival, water was recognised as a divine gift and a domain of the Yazata Anahita, a figure associated with fertility, purity and strength. The Avesta includes hymns to Anahita, describing her as the mighty, life-giving stream who cleanses both body and spirit. The association of water with purity was expressed in rituals of washing and cleansing, where contact with flowing water symbolised restoration of order. Just as fire consumed pollution and transformed it, water dissolved and carried it away, returning the participant to a state of ritual and moral readiness. Wells, rivers and springs were often protected by enclosures or sanctuaries, ensuring their purity was maintained against contamination. To pollute water, whether by waste or by contact with corpses, was considered a grave offence, an act of aligning with Druj against creation. This understanding shaped Zoroastrian legal codes and daily practices, embedding respect for the environment into religious law. Earth, too, was treated as sacred ground, not to be defiled by improper practices. The soil sustained crops, provided the foundation for dwellings, and symbolised stability and endurance. In the Zoroastrian worldview, Earth was aligned with Spenta Armaiti, the divine embodiment of devotion and humility. To cultivate the land in harmony with Asher was an act of religious merit, bringing creation to fruition and resisting the corruption of Achaemenid. Agriculture was sanctified, and farmers were praised in texts as allies of Ahura Mazda, their work framed not merely as economic survival, but as sacred participation in the maintenance of creation. Yet this sanctity also imposed restrictions. Burial of corpses in the earth was forbidden, for death was seen as a domain where Druj gained temporary advantage, and placing the dead into the soil would defile the sacred ground. This prohibition led to the distinctive Zoroastrian practice of exposure, where bodies were placed in open structures known as dakmas, or towers of silence, to be consumed by birds and natural decay, leaving bones that could later be gathered without polluting earth or fire. The practice, startling to outsiders, was a consistent application of the principle that purity of the elements must be preserved at all costs. Air, though less concretely represented in ritual structures, was equally bound to purity. Breath itself was understood as the life force, and the atmosphere carried both the blessing of Ahura Mazda and the potential corruption of Achaemenid. Ritual recitations were performed with care not to expel impurity into the sacred environment, and the act of prayer, with rhythmic breathing and chanting, was a way of aligning oneself with truth through the very air that sustained life. Temples and ritual spaces were constructed to allow controlled circulation, ensuring that the sacred flame and the participants remained in environments of purity. The recognition of air as a carrier of both blessing and corruption extended to laws regarding smoke, vapours, and odours, reflecting an acute awareness of environmental integrity. The emphasis on elemental purity gave Zoroastrianism a distinctive ecological dimension, whereas many ancient religions treated nature as something to be subdued or exploited. Zoroastrian law insisted on the protection of creation. To pollute a river, to neglect the tending of fire, to allow waste to corrupt the soil, or to spread disease through negligence was to side with Ahura Mazda. Conversely, to plant trees, to cultivate fields, to cleanse water sources, and to maintain the flame was to assist Ahura Mazda in the ongoing struggle. This theology of stewardship bound communities to their environment in ways that resonate even in modern discussions of ecological ethics. The balance between human use and divine protection was enshrined in both ritual practice and legal codes, producing a society in which environmental responsibility was inseparable from religious devotion. The ritual system built around the sacred elements illustrates the integration of theology, practice, and social order. The tending of fire was not the task of priests alone. Families kept hearth fires in their homes, recited prayers before them, and used them in ceremonies marking births, marriages, and other life events. Water rituals were part of daily cleansing, ensuring that purity was maintained not only in temples, but in kitchens, fields, and workplaces. Agricultural festivals celebrated the fertility of earth and the cycles of planting and harvest, connecting community life with the cosmic order. Even air was ritually acknowledged in seasonal ceremonies, with prayers marking the equinoxes and solstices that signalled shifts in the atmosphere and natural cycles. The symbolism of the elements also shaped Zoroastrian philosophy of the afterlife and eschatology. Fire, as light, represented the path of the soul after death, illuminating the way across the Chinvat bridge for those aligned with truth. Water, as cleansing, symbolized the purification of the soul, preparing it for entry into the house of song. Earth, as stability, represented the renewal of creation at the final restoration, when corruption would be swept away and the world made fresh. Air, as breath, symbolized the eternal life that would sustain the resurrected. The interplay of these symbols reinforced the coherence of Zoroastrian cosmology, where elements were never inert matter but always living expressions of divine wisdom. This emphasis on purity also produced complex systems of law and social organization. Priests were trained to recognize and address sources of impurity, ranging from physical contamination to moral transgressions. Laws specified procedures for cleansing, including the use of consecrated bull's urine, known as gomez, in purification rites, a practice that, though unusual to modern sensibilities, reflected the seriousness with which purity was guarded. Ritual tools and garments were designed to prevent pollution, with white robes and mouth covers symbolizing and ensuring purity during ceremonies. The role of women, particularly in contexts of menstruation and childbirth, was regulated by detailed purity laws that sought to protect sacred spaces while also acknowledging natural cycles. These laws, while restrictive in some respect, demonstrate the extent to which purity was central to the functioning of both religion and society. The centrality of the elements gave Zoroastrianism a distinctive visual and ritual identity that distinguished it from neighbouring traditions. Greek observers, encountering Persian practices, noted the prominence of fire temples and the absence of idols, contrasting this with their own sculptural traditions. Indian texts reflecting on Iranian practices recognized similarities in the veneration of natural forces, but remarked on the stricter purity laws of the Zoroastrians. Even in later centuries, when Zoroastrian communities migrated to India as Parsis, their fire temples and distinctive funerary practices marked them as a unique community, defined by their fidelity to elemental purity. Over time, the reverence for elements was integrated into imperial ideology, particularly under the Achaemenid and Sasanian dynasties. Royal inscriptions refer to Ahura Mazda as creator of heaven and earth, emphasizing the cosmic legitimacy of kingship. The king, as protector of the realm, was also protector of fire, water and soil, tasked with maintaining their purity as part of his divine mandate. Public rituals involving fire and water were staged to demonstrate this responsibility, binding the fate of empire to the preservation of creation. In this way, the theology of elements became the foundation of political as well as religious identity. Even as Zoroastrianism encountered new religions and cultures, its emphasis on purity and elements remained constant. Under Hellenistic influence, under Parthian and Sasanian rule, and even in exile under Islamic dominance, the fire temples continued to burn, the laws of purity continued to be observed, and the symbolic role of earth, water, and air continued to shape identity. These practices provided continuity in times of disruption, serving as tangible markers of faith when texts and institutions were threatened. The flame on the altar, the flowing water kept clean, the earth protected from corruption, the breath reciting prayers of truth. These were the anchors of a community that survived across millennia. The sanctity of the elements in Zoroastrianism thus reflects the integration of cosmology, ritual, law, and identity. Fire, water, earth, and air were not worshipped as gods in themselves, but revered as gifts of Ahura Mazda, channels of his wisdom, and battlegrounds in the struggle against Ahura Mazda. Their preservation was both a religious obligation and a practical necessity, linking theology with environmental stewardship, ethics with daily life, and ritual with political authority. Through these elements, the presence of the divine was made tangible, accessible, and enduring, ensuring that the cosmic battle between truth and lie was never abstract but always grounded in the very materials of existence. The message of Zarathustra began with an individual voice, one prophet reciting hymns that proclaimed the supremacy of Ahura Mazda and the choice between truth and lie. Yet no faith survives on the words of one person alone. The survival of his teaching depended on those who heard, accepted, and carried it forward into households, communities, and eventually into the fabric of empires. To trace the earliest followers of Zoroastrianism is to reconstruct how a radical reform of ritual and belief took root in a world already filled with traditions and competing authorities. The story reveals how a movement of conviction gradually transformed into an organized religion, first among small circles, then within larger tribal networks, and eventually across vast territories of the Iranian plateau. The Gathas themselves give the clearest indications of the difficulties Zarathustra faced in gathering his first adherents. In his own words, he laments opposition, ridicule, and rejection, speaking of hostile priests who clung to the old rituals and leaders who preferred the gods of sacrifice and intoxication. He describes himself as a lonely figure, asking Ahura Mazda who will listen, who will follow, who will support the path of truth. Yet within the same hymns there are references to companions, to those who join him in recitation and prayer, to a small community who begin to embody the new vision. These earliest followers appear to have been drawn from those dissatisfied with the excesses of the old order. Farmers weary of costly sacrifices, families seeking stability in truth, and individuals moved by the clarity of his ethical message. Their commitment transformed them from passive hearers into active participants in a new religious identity. Tradition holds that Zarathustra eventually won the support of a powerful patron, often named as King Vishtaspa, whose conversion secured the survival and expansion of the faith. The story of Vishtaspa's acceptance is central in later narratives, depicted as a turning point when Zoroastrianism shifted from a persecuted sect to a court-supported religion. Whether or not the details are historically precise, the symbolism of royal endorsement is undeniable. By aligning his court with Zarathustra, Vishtaspa provided resources, protection, and prestige, enabling the prophet's message to reach beyond isolated circles. Priests could now organize rituals in stable temples, scribes could begin to preserve hymns, and missionaries could spread the teaching among allied tribes. Royal patronage thus became the bridge from fragile beginnings to lasting tradition. The social structures of early Iranian communities further facilitated the spread of Zoroastrianism. Tribal networks, bound by kinship and alliances, provided channels through which ideas could move from one group to another. When chiefs or clan leaders adopted the new faith, their households and dependents often followed, integrating Zoroastrian practices into the daily rhythms of communal life. Marriages, feasts, and seasonal festivals became opportunities for recitation of the Gathas and performance of rituals aligned with Ahura Mazda. The emphasis on truth, good thoughts, good words, and good deeds provided a moral code that reinforced social bonds, while the rejection of excessive sacrifice and intoxication reduced burdens on households, making the faith attractive to ordinary people. The first Zoroastrian communities distinguished themselves through their practices of purity, their reverence for fire and water, and their ethical discipline. Outsiders recognized them by their avoidance of polluting practices, their refusal to sacrifice cattle in the old manner, and their insistence on truthfulness in dealings. These distinctions gave them a clear identity in the midst of a diverse religious landscape. The role of priests, now reorganized as custodians of fire temples and teachers of doctrine, further consolidated communal life. Priests preserved hymns, taught prayers to children, and enforced purity laws, ensuring that the faith was transmitted across generations. The continuity of these communities across centuries testifies to the success of this organization. Archaeological evidence from the early 1st millennium BCE suggests the presence of fire altars and ritual structures in regions associated with early Iranian settlement. While direct identification with Zarathustra's first followers is difficult, the continuity of practice supports the idea that small communities gradually expanded their influence through recognizable rituals centered on fire, water, and purity. The geographic spread of these practices, from Bactria and Margiana in the northeast to Media and Persis in the west, indicates that the message travelled along migration and trade routes, adapting to local conditions while maintaining core principles. This diffusion reflects the dual nature of Zoroastrianism as both universal in message and adaptable in form. The role of women in these early communities, though less documented, was significant in the transmission of faith. Ritual purity laws regulated their participation, yet within the household they preserved prayers, taught children, and maintained domestic fires. Marriage rituals incorporated Zoroastrian prayers, embedding the faith into family structures. The emphasis on truthfulness and devotion gave women a role as moral exemplars within the community, reinforcing the continuity of belief through everyday practice. This domestic dimension, often overlooked in political narratives, was essential for the survival of Zoroastrianism through times of upheaval. The process of spreading the faith was not merely religious but also political. Tribes and kingdoms that adopted Zoroastrianism often did so in part because it reinforced their authority. The dualism of truth and lie provided a language for legitimizing rule. Just rulers were aligned with Asher, unjust ones with Druj. Kings who patronized Zoroastrianism could present themselves as defenders of creation, guardians of fire and water, protectors of purity. This ideological framework strengthened their claims and provided moral justification for governance. In return, the religion gained visibility, stability, and institutional support. The mutual reinforcement of faith and kingship became a hallmark of Zoroastrian expansion. As the message spread, it encountered diverse populations with their own traditions. In some cases, Zoroastrianism absorbed elements of local cults, reinterpreting them in light of Ahura Mazda's supremacy. The goddess Anahita, associated with waters and fertility, was integrated as a Yazata under Ahura Mazda, her cult flourishing alongside the central doctrines of purity and truth. Mithra, once a powerful Indo-Iranian deity of contracts and oaths, retained his role as guardian of truth within the Zoroastrian framework, becoming a Yazata who enforced agreements and punished deceit. These incorporations reveal the flexibility of early Zoroastrianism, able to adapt and integrate while maintaining its central dualism. Such adaptability facilitated its spread across diverse regions without losing its core identity. The early spread of Zoroastrianism was not without resistance. Priests of the old order, attached to sacrifice and intoxicating rituals, continued to oppose the new faith. Neighbouring cultures with their own pantheons viewed the Zoroastrian rejection of idols and animal sacrifice with suspicion. Conflicts between communities sometimes broke out, reflecting the deep stakes of religious transformation. Yet the persistence of Zoroastrian communities demonstrates that despite opposition, the faith offered something compelling: a coherent worldview, a clear moral code, and rituals that sanctified daily life without excessive burden. Its survival through these confrontations testifies to the resilience of its earliest followers. The emergence of written texts was a gradual process, but oral transmission was already sufficient to preserve the core teachings. Priests memorized the Gathas and passed them down with meticulous care, ensuring accuracy through repetition and recitation. These hymns were recited during rituals, festivals, and family ceremonies, embedding them in the rhythm of communal life. The discipline of oral tradition, combined with the ethical emphasis on truth, created a strong culture of preservation. The eventual codification of the Avesta centuries later would not have been possible without the dedication of these early communities to accurate transmission. The migration of Zoroastrianism across the Iranian plateau also laid the foundation for its later adoption by empires. As tribes and kingdoms coalesced into larger political entities, the presence of established Zoroastrian communities made it natural for rulers to embrace the faith as a unifying ideology. By the time of the Achaemenid Empire, Zoroastrianism was already widespread enough that its concepts of truth, purity, and divine kingship could be articulated in royal inscriptions and enacted in imperial rituals. The faith's early spread had created the infrastructure upon which empires could build, transforming local practices into state ideology. The continuity of these communities was also evident in their response to crisis. When faced with famine, disease, or conflict, the rituals of purity, fire, and prayer provided stability. Families gathered around sacred flames, reciting prayers for protection. Communities purified water sources, reinforced moral codes, and sought guidance through the words of priests. These practices not only maintained faith, but also reinforced social cohesion, providing resilience in the face of adversity. The endurance of Zoroastrian communities across centuries can be traced back to these earliest practices, where belief and daily survival were inseparably linked. In the long arc of history, the spread of Zoroastrianism among its earliest followers represents a transformation from solitary prophecy to communal identity. What began as the voice of Zarathustra became the shared practice of families, tribes, and kingdoms. The purity of fire and water, the moral code of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, the rejection of false gods, and the hope of ultimate triumph all became woven into the fabric of communities that carried the faith forward. Their dedication ensured that Zoroastrianism did not fade after the prophet's death, but continued to grow, preparing the way for its role as the guiding religion of empires and the enduring identity of a people scattered yet united across centuries. When the Achaemenid dynasty rose to prominence in the 6th century BCE, uniting the scattered tribes and kingdoms of the Iranian plateau into an empire that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt, it did more than alter the political map of the ancient world. It provided the stage on which Zoroastrianism would transition from the faith of local communities to the ideological backbone of imperial power. The Achaemenid kings, beginning with Cyrus the Great and culminating in the vast reign of Darius and Xerxes, governed over a multi-ethnic, multi-religious population, and in doing so, they needed an ideology that could sustain unity while asserting legitimacy. Zoroastrianism, with its emphasis on truth, justice, and divinely sanctioned rule, provided precisely the framework they required. The inscriptions left by these rulers, etched into cliffsides, palaces, and monuments, offer the clearest window into how Zoroastrian ideas were woven into imperial ideology. At Behistun, Darius the Great recorded his victories, his lineage, and his claim to the throne under the watchful protection of Ahura Mazda. The god is invoked repeatedly as the source of kingship, the one who bestowed dominion, and the guardian who ensures justice against rebels and liars. This consistent invocation of Ahura Mazda establishes him not as one god among many, but as the supreme authority behind the king's power. The rebels whom Darius defeated are denounced not merely as political rivals, but as liars, aligning them with Drudge, the force of deceit. In this way, political conflict was cast in moral and cosmic terms. To oppose the king was to oppose truth, and to submit to the king was to uphold Asher. This alignment of political authority with cosmic order exemplifies how Zoroastrian theology was translated into imperial ideology. Cyrus the Great, remembered for his conquest of Babylon and his relatively tolerant policies, is often associated with the beginning of this integration. While direct Zoroastrian references are scarce in his surviving records, the ethos of his rule reflects the moral orientation of Zarathustra's teachings. His famous decree allowing exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples illustrates a concern for justice and respect for diverse traditions, consistent with the Zoroastrian principle that rulers must protect creation and uphold truth. Though the precise extent of his personal devotion to Zoroastrianism is debated, the trajectory of Achaemenid ideology under his successors makes clear that Ahura Mazda became the central divine authority for the dynasty. The use of Zoroastrian concepts in Achaemenid governance went beyond inscriptions. Administrative practices, legal codes, and royal rituals reflected the integration of Asher into the fabric of empire. Justice was emphasized as the king's duty, with judges and officials expected to act truthfully. Corruption and falsehood were condemned not only as administrative failures, but as moral betrayals. Taxation, land distribution, and military service were framed in terms of fairness and order, aligning the empire's bureaucratic machinery with the ideals of truth and justice. The king, as king of kings, was portrayed as the ultimate guarantor of this order, ruling not by arbitrary will but under the mandate of Ahura Mazda. The architecture of the Achaemenid capitals, particularly Persepolis and Susa, also reflected Zoroastrian ideals. Reliefs carved into the walls depict processions of representatives from across the empire, bringing tribute in orderly fashion, symbolizing the unity of diverse peoples under the rule of truth. The imagery avoids chaotic battle scenes common in Assyrian art, and instead emphasizes harmony, cooperation, and order, resonating with the concept of Asher. The presence of fire altars in these palaces suggests that royal rituals centered on the sacred flame, linking kingship with the most visible symbol of divine purity. Though the empire tolerated and even supported the diverse religious practices of its subjects, its own ceremonial core revolved around Zoroastrian symbols, making clear where ultimate legitimacy resided. The role of the Magi, the priestly class, became particularly important in this context. Though the term Magi has been used broadly by Greek sources to describe various Persian religious specialists, within the Achaemenid Empire they functioned as custodians of ritual, interpreters of divine will, and advisors to kings. They tended fires, performed sacrifices, and recited prayers that linked royal authority with divine order. Their presence at court and their role in public ceremonies ensured that Zoroastrian practices were embedded in the daily functioning of the empire. The Magi also played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting the hymns and doctrines of the faith, maintaining continuity between local communities and imperial institutions. Zoroastrianism also shaped the empire's approach to law and governance. The principle that truth must govern was reflected in the condemnation of lying in royal inscriptions. Rebels and traitors were consistently described as liars, placing political rebellion within a cosmic framework. This moralization of politics served both ideological and practical purposes. It provided a universal language that could unite diverse populations under a shared vision of justice, and it legitimized harsh punishments for dissent by casting them as necessary defenses of truth. In this way, the empire's stability was maintained not only by military might, but by the moral weight of Zoroastrian dualism. The interaction between Zoroastrianism and other religions under the Achaemenids is particularly notable. The empire encompassed Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and many others, each with their own deities and traditions. While these were tolerated, often supported, and sometimes even patronized by the kings, the underlying ideology of the empire remained Zoroastrian. The rebuilding of temples in Babylon and Jerusalem under Cyrus reflects this policy of tolerance, but inscriptions make clear that the king's own devotion was directed to Ahura Mazda. This ability to balance universal rule with particular religious identities was a hallmark of Achaemenid governance, one that owed much to the universality of Zarathustra's message. By emphasizing truth over falsehood, order over chaos, and justice over oppression, Zoroastrianism provided principles broad enough to encompass diverse populations, while still grounding imperial ideology in a distinct religious framework. The reign of Xerxes, known for his campaigns against Greece, also reveals the religious dimensions of Achaemenid rule. In his inscriptions he speaks of destroying the shrines of Deivas, false gods, and dedicating them to Ahura Mazda. This suggests a more assertive Zoroastrian orthodoxy, where tolerance was balanced with the condemnation of certain practices considered aligned with falsehood. The destruction of idolatrous shrines illustrates the persistence of Zarathustra's original critique of polytheistic rituals carried now into the policies of empire. Such acts also serve to strengthen the moral authority of the king, presenting him as the enforcer of truth not only in politics but in religion. The Achaemenid integration of Zoroastrianism extended into military ideology as well. Soldiers were exhorted to fight not only for the king but for truth, with loyalty framed as alignment with Asher. Betrayal, desertion, and treachery were castigated as lies, weakening not just armies but the cosmic struggle itself. This infusion of moral dualism into warfare provided additional motivation for loyalty and discipline, embedding the faith even in the structures of imperial defence. The empire's vast armies, composed of diverse peoples, were unified not only by command but by the ideological framework that cast their service as part of the battle between truth and falsehood. The Achaemenid use of Zoroastrian ideology also shaped their legacy in the eyes of foreign observers. Greek writers such as Herodotus, though often hostile to Persia, nevertheless noted the prominence of truth in Persian culture. They recorded that Persian boys were taught from an early age to ride, to shoot, and to speak the truth, reflecting the centrality of this virtue. Greek accounts also describe the Magi and their rituals, recognizing their influence in Persian society. Though often filtered through misunderstanding, these observations reveal that the Zoroastrian emphasis on truth and purity was visible even to outsiders, marking the empire with a distinctive religious identity. The integration of Zoroastrianism into Achaemenid ideology did not mean uniformity or the suppression of diversity. Local deities continued to be worshipped, local rituals practiced, and local traditions preserved. But at the imperial core, the kings consistently invoked Ahura Mazda, aligned themselves with Asher, and condemned Druj. This central framework provided coherence without erasing diversity, a balance that allowed the empire to govern over vast and varied populations. It also ensured that Zoroastrianism was not confined to private devotion, but became a public and political force, shaping the identity of the empire as a whole. The durability of this integration is evident in the way later empires inherited and adapted it. The Parthians and Sasanians, though distinct in many ways, drew upon the precedent set by the Achaemenids in aligning kingship with Zoroastrianism. The idea that the ruler governed under the mandate of Ahura Mazda, that justice and truth were the measure of legitimacy, and that rebellion was a form of falsehood remained central. In this sense, the Achaemenid era established the template for Zoroastrian imperial ideology, one that would endure for centuries and leave echoes in the political theology of other cultures. The story of Zoroastrianism under the Achaemenids thus illustrates how a faith born from the hymns of a prophet could shape the destiny of an empire. From fire altars in palaces to inscriptions on mountainsides, from the administration of justice to the conduct of war, the principles of truth, purity, and divine kingship permeated every level of imperial life. The earliest followers who recited prayers in small communities could hardly have imagined that their faith would become the language of empire, binding millions under the authority of kings who saw themselves as guardians of cosmic order. Yet this transformation was possible because the core message of Zoroastrianism, that truth must be chosen, preserved, and defended, proved powerful enough to sustain not only households and villages, but the vast machinery of one of the greatest empires of antiquity. Among the figures who carried Zoroastrianism from the sphere of prophetic vision into the daily life of communities and the public life of empires were the Magi, a priestly class whose presence in Iranian society long preceded the rise of the Achaemenids, and who came to be identified as the authoritative custodians of ritual, law, and sacred knowledge. To understand their role is to trace how religion became institutionalized, how rituals gained continuity, and how political authority was interwoven with religious legitimacy. The Magi were more than temple functionaries. They were guardians of purity, interpreters of divine will, advisors to kings, and transmitters of a tradition that demanded precision, discipline, and reverence. Their presence ensured that the abstract truths of Zarathustra's hymns became embodied in ceremonies, texts, and communal identity. Greek writers were among the first outsiders to describe the Magi, often with fascination and confusion. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, identified them as one of the tribes of the Medes and described their role in sacrifice and ritual. He portrayed them as specialists who alone could conduct certain ceremonies, whose chants accompanied sacrifices, and whose interpretations carried authority in matters of religion. Later writers embellished these accounts, associating the Magi with magic, astrology, and secret knowledge, an interpretation that coloured their reputation in the classical world and influenced later European use of the term magic. Yet behind these distortions lies the reality of a priestly class deeply rooted in Zoroastrianism, whose authority derived not from trickery, but from their mastery of purity laws, their control of sacred rituals, and their role as mediators between kings and the divine. The duties of the Magi encompassed every aspect of religious life. Their most visible role was the tending of sacred fires in temples, ensuring that flames burned continuously, fed only with pure fuel, and shielded from defilement. The fire, symbol of Asher, demanded constant vigilance, and priests were trained in detailed rules for approaching, feeding, and guarding it. Beyond the fire temple, the Magi presided over public rituals, reciting the Avesta in ceremonies that marked seasonal festivals, royal proclamations, and community gatherings. Their recitations were more than prayer. They were acts of cosmic alignment, believed to strengthen truth against the lie. In domestic settings, they officiated at births, marriages, and funerals, guiding families through the rituals that sanctified the stages of life. By their presence, they transformed personal milestones into events tied to the cosmic struggle. The training of Magi was rigorous and lengthy. Young boys, often from priestly families, were instructed in the memorization of the Avesta, learning thousands of verses by heart in an oral tradition that prized accuracy above all. They mastered ritual purity laws, the use of ritual implements, and the preparation of consecrated substances such as Haoma and Gomez. instruction also included interpretation of doctrine, the symbolic meanings of rituals, and the legal aspects of purity and sin. The discipline required was immense, demanding not only intellectual ability but physical and moral purity. For priests were expected to embody the truth they proclaimed. This rigorous training ensured continuity across generations, preserving the faith even through political upheavals. The authority of the Magi was not confined to the temple. They occupied prominent positions at court, advising kings on matters of religion, legitimacy, and law. In royal inscriptions, kings present themselves as protectors of truth and guardians of fire, roles they could not fulfill without priestly mediation. The Magi conducted coronation ceremonies, sanctified treaties, and offered sacrifices on behalf of the empire. They advised on omens, interpreted dreams, and pronounced judgments in disputes involving purity or oaths. In this way, they bridged the realms of religion and politics, ensuring that governance was seen as aligned with divine order. Their influence was not only spiritual but institutional, woven into the very fabric of empire. The Magi also functioned as custodians of law. Zoroastrianism, with its intricate purity codes and moral demands, required careful interpretation and enforcement. Priests served as judges in cases involving contamination of elements, disputes over ritual observance, and violations of moral conduct. Their rulings carried weight because they were believed to reflect divine truth, not merely human opinion. This authority extended into family law, inheritance, and property disputes, areas where religious and social order were inseparable. The legal power of the Magi reinforced their role as arbiters of justice, making them indispensable to both community life and imperial administration. Festivals provided another arena for their influence. Seasonal celebrations such as Nowruz, the Persian New Year, required elaborate rituals led by priests. These festivals aligned agricultural cycles with cosmic rhythms, marking the renewal of creation and the triumph of light over darkness. The Magi organized and presided over these ceremonies, reciting prayers, preparing fires, and leading communities in collective devotion. Their leadership ensured that festivals were not mere social gatherings, but moments of cosmic significance, linking daily life with eternal truth. The visibility of priests in these public rituals reinforced their authority and made them symbols of continuity in the lives of ordinary people. The Magi's authority extended into education and transmission of culture. By training new generations in the Avesta, they preserved not only religious texts, but also linguistic and cultural heritage. The use of Avestan, even when it was no longer a spoken language, gave their recitations a sacred character, much as Latin would later serve in Christian liturgy. This preservation of language reinforced continuity, binding communities to their past and to the prophet's words. Priestly schools thus became centres of cultural as well as religious transmission, ensuring that Zoroastrian identity endured even under foreign domination. Their emphasis on purity laws sometimes placed them at odds with other groups, particularly in contexts of intermarriage, trade, and diplomacy. Strict rules against pollution required careful regulation of contact with outsiders, particularly concerning food, water, and burial practices. These restrictions, enforced by priests, reinforced communal boundaries and preserved religious identity, but also created tensions in multi-religious environments. Yet such strictness was also a source of resilience, ensuring that Zoroastrian communities maintain their distinctiveness even when surrounded by larger and often dominant cultures. The prestige of the Magi was both a source of stability and a target for criticism. Greek accounts sometimes portrayed them as manipulative, controlling kings through superstition, or as rigid in their enforcement of ritual. Within Zoroastrian tradition itself, reformist voices occasionally arose, challenging the excessive authority of priests or accusing them of corrupting the prophet's message with ritual elaboration. These tensions reflect the inevitable challenges faced by any religious institution. The balance between preserving tradition and adapting to new circumstances between guiding communities and dominating them. Nevertheless, the Magi remained indispensable, their authority rooted in their role as keepers of the sacred flame and interpreters of divine law. The influence of the Magi extended beyond Iran. Through the conquests of the Achaemenids, their presence was felt in Babylon, Egypt, and even Greece, where their rituals became known and sometimes imitated. The famous story of the Magi visiting the infant Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, though a later Christian legend, reflects the enduring association of Persian priests with wisdom and divine knowledge in the imagination of other cultures. This reputation, whether accurate or not, ensured that the name of the Magi carried weight far beyond the borders of their homeland. In the Sasanian period, centuries later, the Magi's authority became even more formalized, with a hierarchy of priests presiding over a centralized religious establishment. Yet the foundations of this institution were laid in the earlier centuries, when priests established themselves as essential mediators of truth and order. The continuity of priestly authority across these periods illustrates the enduring importance of the Magi as the custodians of Zoroastrian identity, ensuring its survival through empire, conquest, and diaspora. The Magi embodied the transformation of Zoroastrianism from prophetic teaching to institutional religion. By tending fires, enforcing purity, guiding kings, judging disputes, preserving texts, and leading festivals, they ensured that the faith was not confined to abstract ideals but embedded in daily life. Their authority shaped how communities lived, how empires ruled, and how cultures beyond Persia imagined religion itself. Through their discipline and influence, the voice of Zarathustra continued to resonate, not as a distant memory, but as a living tradition sustained by ritual, law, and authority. The preservation of Zarathustra's voice and the system of beliefs that developed around it depended not only on memory and ritual, but eventually on the formation of sacred texts, collections that bound hymns, prayers, laws, and liturgies into a body of literature revered by communities across centuries. These writings, known collectively as the Avesta, became the foundation upon which Zoroastrianism was transmitted, interpreted, and practiced. At its heart lie the Gathas, the hymns attributed directly to Zarathustra, whose archaic verses stand as the earliest surviving testimony of his vision. Around these core hymns, additional texts accumulated over time, reflecting the growth of ritual practice, the expansion of doctrine, and the needs of empires that sought to structure their governance through divine order. To understand the Avesta is to see how oral tradition crystallized into scripture, how ritual became codified, and how communities preserved their faith against the challenges of time, conquest, and dispersion. The Gathas occupy a unique place within this body of literature. Composed in an early form of the Avestan language, their verses are dense, elusive, and poetic, demanding careful recitation and interpretation. In them, Zarathustra speaks in his own voice, addressing Ahura Mazda, lamenting opposition, exhorting followers to truth, and describing the cosmic struggle between Asher and Druj. Their tone is personal and urgent, revealing a prophet engaged in dialogue with both the divine and his community. Because they are embedded within the larger Avesta, they became not merely historical relics but living scripture, recited in rituals and revered as the most authentic expression of the prophet's teaching. Their archaic language made them difficult for later generations to fully understand, but this very difficulty enhanced their authority, marking them as the sacred words of antiquity. Around these hymns developed the rest of the Avesta, a collection that reflects centuries of religious evolution. The Yasna, the central liturgical text, incorporates the Gathas, but also includes additional prayers and rituals that expanded the framework of worship. Recited by priests in elaborate ceremonies centered on the sacred fire, the Yasna structured the liturgy of Zoroastrianism, guiding communities through acts of devotion that aligned them with cosmic truth. Within the Yasna, the recitation of the Gatha served as the climax, ensuring that Zarathustra's voice remained at the core of worship, even as rituals grew more elaborate. The yasna also preserves details of the preparation of haoma, the sacred drink whose ritual use connected participants with divine vitality, linking Zoroastrianism with its Indo-Iranian heritage, while giving it new meaning under Ahura Mazda's supremacy. Another significant portion of the Avesta is the Visparad, a collection of supplements to the yasna that expand its liturgical framework. These texts provided additional invocations to divine beings, especially the Amisha Spentas and various Yazatas, reinforcing their role in the cosmic order. The Visparad illustrates how Zoroastrian worship adapted to the needs of large communities and festivals, extending the liturgy beyond the personal dialogue of the Gaithas into communal praise of the divine hierarchy. The Yashts, hymns dedicated to specific Yazatas, further illustrate this development. Composed in a more accessible style than the Gaithas, they celebrate deities such as Mithra, Anahita, and Srausha, recounting their myths, attributes, and roles in the cosmic struggle. These hymns connected communities to figures that embodied virtues, natural forces, and protective powers, making the faith tangible and immediate. The Vendidad, or Videvdat, represents another dimension of the Avesta, focusing on law, purity, and ritual regulation. Its name, meaning law against the demons, reflects its concern with protecting creation from pollution and corruption. The Vendidad contains detailed prescriptions for dealing with death, disease, and impurity, including the handling of corpses, the cleansing of water and earth, and the punishment of sins. It also recounts mythological narratives, such as the creation of the world and the Great Flood, situating its legal codes within a cosmic framework. To modern readers, the Vendidad often appears rigid and severe, with elaborate rituals and harsh penalties, but for ancient communities it provided clarity and stability, ensuring that the struggle against Druj was fought not only in thought and word, but in every detail of daily life. The Avesta as a whole was not a single, unified book, but a collection that grew over time, transmitted orally for centuries before being committed to writing. The process of oral transmission demanded extraordinary discipline from priests, who memorized vast sections, reciting them in daily rituals and festivals. The accuracy of this transmission was safeguarded by the emphasis on truth, making faithful recitation itself an act of alignment with Asher. The eventual writing down of the Avesta is traditionally associated with the Sasanian period, when the state sought to codify and centralize religion. According to tradition, earlier manuscripts had been lost or destroyed during the conquest of Alexander the Great, when fire temples were desecrated and texts scattered. The Sasanian kings, particularly under Khosrow Thurul, are said to have gathered priests to collect, edit, and preserve what remained of the Avesta, organizing it into the structure that survives in fragments today. The preservation of the Avesta was not merely a literary achievement, but a cultural and religious act of survival. Each verse represented continuity with the prophet, each hymn a link across centuries of upheaval. When Zoroastrian communities found themselves under foreign domination, whether Greek, Parthian, or Islamic, the recitation of the Avesta preserved identity and coherence. Even when manuscripts were lost or incomplete, the oral tradition ensured that the essential hymns endured. This resilience explains why Zoroastrianism, though reduced in numbers, never vanished, sustained by the words recited daily in temples and homes. The language of the Avesta, though no longer a spoken tongue, carried sacred weight. Its archaic forms connected worshippers to antiquity, distinguishing scripture from everyday speech. The use of Avestan in liturgy reinforced the sense of continuity and authenticity, even as communities spoke Middle Persian, Parthian, or other languages in daily life. Commentaries and translations into later languages were necessary for understanding, but the original words retained their sanctity. This separation of sacred and ordinary language parallels developments in other traditions, such as Sanskrit in Hindu ritual or Latin in medieval Christianity, illustrating the universal power of language to preserve and sanctify tradition. The Gathas within this framework remain the touchstone of authenticity. Priests and theologians debated their meaning, seeking to interpret the prophet's archaic words for new generations. Their ambiguity allowed for rich interpretation, sustaining discussions about the nature of Ahura Mazda, the role of Achaemenid, and the responsibilities of humanity. The Gathas thus functioned not only as liturgical texts, but as theological foundations, inspiring reflection and adaptation. The surrounding Avesta, with its hymns, laws and rituals, provided structure and guidance, but the Gathas ensured that the voice of Zarathustra himself was never lost. The impact of these texts extended beyond ritual into law, culture and identity. The Vendidad shaped purity laws that governed burial practices, food preparation, and daily hygiene. The Yashts preserved myths and stories that provided cultural continuity, connecting communities to their past and inspiring later literature. The Yasna structured rituals that bound families and communities together, ensuring cohesion and solidarity. The Avesta thus functioned as more than scripture. It was the foundation of a way of life, integrating belief, practice, and identity into a coherent whole. The importance of the Avesta was recognized even by those outside the Zoroastrian tradition. Greek and Roman writers, encountering Persian priests, noted their recitations and referred to their scriptures, though often misunderstanding their content. Islamic scholars, writing in later centuries, described the Avesta and its preservation, sometimes with respect, sometimes with hostility, but always recognizing its significance. The survival of these references, combined with the manuscripts preserved by Zoroastrian communities, ensures that the Avesta continues to inform our understanding of one of the world's oldest continuous religious traditions. For Zoroastrians themselves, the Avesta remains not merely a record of the past, but a living presence. Its recitation in fire temples connects worshippers to their ancestors, to their prophet, and to their god. Its hymns shape their understanding of the world, its laws guide their conduct, and its rituals sanctify their lives. The survival of these texts across millennia, through conquest, exile, and dispersion, testifies to the resilience of a faith that has always recognized the power of words. In a religion where truth itself is the ultimate principle, the faithful preservation and recitation of sacred words becomes the highest form of devotion. Through the Gathas and the Avesta, the voice of Zarathustra continues to speak, not as a distant echo, but as a living guide, reminding each generation that their thoughts, words, and deeds matter in the cosmic struggle between truth and lie. Religion in ancient Persia was not confined to temples or royal inscriptions, but permeated every aspect of daily life, shaping how people ate, worked, married, mourned, and governed themselves. Zoroastrianism, with its emphasis on purity, truth, and the constant struggle between Asher and Druj, demanded vigilance in both ritual practice and ordinary conduct. To live as a follower of Ahura Mazda was to make every moment an act of devotion, every decision a contribution to the cosmic struggle. The practices that developed in this context reveal not only the theological priorities of the faith, but also the rhythms of life in communities that align themselves with Zarathustra's vision. At the heart of ritual practice stood the fire temple, the most visible symbol of communal devotion. Here priests tended sacred flames, reciting the Avesta as families and communities gathered to participate in liturgy. The central ceremony, the yasna, structured worship through prayers, chants, and offerings, uniting participants with Ahura Mazda and the Amesha Spentas. The preparation of haoma, the sacred drink pressed from a plant whose identity has long been debated, was a central feature of this ritual, symbolizing vitality, strength, and divine blessing. The act of pressing, mixing, and consuming haoma was accompanied by recitations that linked the community to divine forces, reinforcing their role in sustaining creation. The temple, however, was not the only space of devotion. Households kept hearth fires, recited daily prayers, and maintained purity in kitchens and courtyards, making every home a microcosm of the cosmic order. Daily devotion was structured by specific prayers, recited at dawn, noon, sunset, and night. These prayers, often short passages from the Avesta, oriented individuals toward Ahura Mazda, reminding them that each part of the day was an opportunity to affirm truth. The recitations included invocations to the Amesha Spentas, reinforcing virtues such as good mind, righteousness, and devotion. The discipline of daily prayer transformed ordinary routines into acts of alignment with Asher, sanctifying even the most mundane tasks. Farmers prayed as they sowed and harvested, artisans prayed as they worked, and travellers prayed before journeys, recognizing that divine presence was constant. Purity laws shaped much of daily life, governing food preparation, personal hygiene, and social interaction. Water had to be protected from contamination, requiring care in washing, cooking, and disposal of waste. Fire was guarded against pollution, with strict rules about what could and could not be burned. Contact with corpses, seen as vulnerable to Druj, imposed elaborate rituals of purification, shaping funerary customs and the use of exposure in dachmas. Even speech was regulated by the demand for truthfulness, with oaths carrying profound religious weight. To break an oath was not only a social offence, but an act of siding with Achaemenid, undermining cosmic order. In this way, every action, from the way food was prepared to the words spoken in conversation, carried moral and religious significance. Marriage ceremonies reflected these principles. The union of man and woman was sanctified not merely as a social contract, but as a sacred alliance in the service of creation. Priests officiated with prayers, invoking Ahura Mazda and the Amesha Spentas to bless the couple with fertility, health, and devotion to truth. The ceremony included the recitation of oaths, the exchange of gifts, and the lighting of fire, symbolizing the presence of divine order in the household. The family thus created was not only a private unit, but a microcosm of the cosmic struggle, tasked with raising children in truth and contributing to the preservation of creation. Funerary practices reveal the seriousness with which purity was maintained. Because death was considered a temporary triumph of Dru, corpses were viewed as highly polluting. Burial in earth or cremation in fire would defile sacred elements, so exposure became the standard practice. Bodies were placed in open structures known as dachmas, or towers of silence, where birds and natural decay removed flesh, leaving bones that could be collected and stored without polluting earth or fire. Priests oversaw these ceremonies, reciting prayers for the soul's journey across the Chinvat Bridge, where its deeds would be weighed. Families mourned with rituals of purification and remembrance, reinforcing the belief that even in death the struggle between truth and lie continued. These practices, though shocking to outsiders, embodied the consistency of Zoroastrian devotion to purity. Festivals punctuated the year with collective expressions of faith. Nowruz, the Persian New Year celebrated at the spring equinox, symbolized renewal, fertility, and the triumph of light over darkness. Families cleaned their homes, prepared special meals, and gathered around fires to mark the transition of seasons. Priests led communal prayers, invoking blessings for the year ahead. Other festivals marked the cycles of agriculture, the solstices and equinoxes, and the remembrance of the dead. Each festival reinforced the integration of cosmic rhythms with human life, ensuring that communities lived in harmony with the cycles of creation. Participation in these events was both a religious duty and a source of joy, binding communities together in shared devotion. The role of priests in daily life extended beyond ritual. They served as advisors in disputes, ensuring that truth prevailed in social interactions. They interpreted omens, guided families through decisions, and enforced purity laws. Their presence at births, marriages, and funerals ensured that every stage of life was sanctified, yet devotion was not limited to priestly oversight. families maintained their own rituals, reciting prayers, tending fires, and practicing purity in daily routines. This balance between priestly authority and household devotion ensured that the faith was embedded at every level of society. Zoroastrian devotion also shaped ethics in commerce and governance. Merchants were expected to conduct trade honestly, with contracts sealed by oaths invoking Ahura Mazda. Kings and officials were judged not only by their power, but by their adherence to truth. Justice, fairness, and protection of the weak were demanded by the principle of Asher, making governance itself a form of devotion. Corruption, deceit, and exploitation were condemned as acts of drudge, weakening both society and the cosmic order. This integration of religion and ethics created a culture where devotion was inseparable from law and politics. The experience of ordinary believers illustrates how devotion was lived on a daily basis. Farmers rose with the sun, reciting prayers before tending fields, recognizing that their labor supported creation. Mothers taught children prayers, instilling truth as a way of life. Artisans whispered invocations before their tools, aligning work with divine order. Travelers offered prayers before setting out, seeking protection on uncertain roads. These acts were not dramatic but consistent, weaving faith into every moment. The result was a society where religion was not an occasional practice but the very fabric of existence. The importance of ritual practice in ancient Persia is underscored by its endurance. Even under foreign rule, when fire temples were destroyed or suppressed, families continued to maintain small fires, recite prayers, and observe purity. Exile and dispersion did not erase devotion, but deepened its role in preserving identity. For Zoroastrian communities scattered across lands, daily rituals became anchors of continuity, linking them to their past and to each other. The survival of these practices into modern times, among Parsis in India and communities in Iran, demonstrates their resilience and centrality. The material culture of devotion further illustrates its depth. Ritual vessels, fire altars, and inscribed prayers have been discovered in archaeological sites across Iran, testifying to the ubiquity of worship. Art depicts priests tending fires, kings invoking Ahura Mazda, and families participating in ceremonies. These artifacts reveal the integration of religion into art, architecture, and everyday objects. They show that devotion was not confined to abstract belief, but expressed in tangible forms that permeated Persian life. The moral dimension of daily devotion cannot be overstated. By insisting that every thought, word, and deed had cosmic significance, Zoroastrianism transformed life into a continuous act of worship. The demand for truthfulness shaped speech, the requirement of purity shaped behavior, and the expectation of devotion shaped relationships. This pervasive moral framework made Zoroastrianism not only a religion of rituals, but a way of life, guiding every decision and interaction. In this way, ritual practice and daily devotion were inseparable from ethics, ensuring that the faith was lived, not only believed. The endurance of these practices across centuries reflects their effectiveness in binding communities together and preserving identity. While empires rose and fell, while conquerors came and went, the recitation of prayers at dawn, the tending of household fires, the observance of purity, and the celebration of festivals continued. These acts preserved Zoroastrianism not as a distant memory but as a living tradition. Through ritual practice and daily devotion, ancient Persians wove their faith into the fabric of their lives, ensuring its survival through every trial. For the Zoroastrians of ancient Persia, death was not simply the end of a biological process, but the most decisive moment in the life of the soul, the passage from the realm of human choice to the realm of divine judgment. Zarathustra's teaching that every thought, word, and deed carried cosmic significance culminated in the conviction that at the moment of death, the sum of those choices would be weighed. The imagery that developed around this conviction gave vivid form to the faith's ethical dualism, offering both hope for the righteous and warning for the deceitful. Among the most enduring of these images is the Chinvat Bridge, the span across which every soul must pass after death, a liminal threshold that reveals the true nature of one's life and determines one's eternal destiny. The handling of death in Zoroastrian practice was framed first by the concern for purity. A corpse, as the seat of decay and corruption, was seen as immediately vulnerable to Druj, the force of the lie that spread disorder and pollution. To protect the sacred elements of earth, fire and water, corpses could not be buried in the ground or burned in flames, lest they defile what was pure. Instead, they were exposed in dakmas, or towers of silence, where the flesh would be consumed by birds and natural decay, leaving bones that could later be gathered into ossuaries. Priests oversaw these rituals, reciting prayers that both protected the living from impurity and guided the soul on its journey. This practice, misunderstood by outsiders, reflected the Zoroastrian conviction that death was a battlefield where truth and lie contended, and purity had to be preserved even in mourning. The journey of the soul began immediately after death. According to tradition, for 3 nights the soul lingered near the body, experiencing visions of its earthly deeds. For the righteous, these nights brought comfort and the presence of a beautiful maiden, personification of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. For the wicked, the companion was a hideous figure, embodiment of lies and corruption. This personal encounter made tangible the principle that life's choices had real consequences, not abstract or delayed, but immediate and experiential. The soul then approached the Chinvat Bridge, the crossing that marked the boundary between the world of the living and the afterlife. The bridge itself was imagined in multiple ways, but always as a test. For the righteous, it widened, allowing safe passage into the house of song, the realm of light, joy, and eternal union with Ahura Mazda. There the soul enjoyed the presence of the divine, the companionship of the just, and the fulfillment of creation's promise. For the wicked, the bridge narrowed to a razor's edge, casting the soul into the house of lies, a place of darkness, stench, and torment, where deceit and corruption prevailed. This vivid imagery reinforced the seriousness of ethical life, making clear that every act of truth strengthened the bridge, while every act of falsehood made it perilous. The judgment was not arbitrary, but a reflection of one's own alignment with Asher or Druj, revealed at the moment of crossing. The role of divine beings in this judgment was central. Mithra, guardian of contracts and oaths, presided over the weighing of deeds, ensuring that promises kept or broken were accounted for. Zoroaster, the divine embodiment of obedience and attentive listening, guided the soul through the process, protecting it from demonic interference. Rashnu, the judge, held the scales on which deeds were measured, ensuring fairness and accuracy. Together these figures ensured that judgment was just, reflecting the core Zoroastrian conviction that truth governs the universe. The presence of multiple divine agents emphasized that judgment was not capricious but orderly, conducted according to principles established by Ahura Mazda. The fate of souls after crossing the bridge reflected the dualism of creation. The righteous entered a realm of light described in hymns as the house of song, where joy, harmony and truth prevailed. This was not merely a place of rest, but of active participation in the fulfillment of creation, a continuation of alignment with Asher. The wicked fell into the house of lies, a place of suffering where deceit reigned, cut off from the presence of the divine. These destinies were not final in an absolute sense, for Zoroastrian eschatology anticipated a final renovation of the world, when Angra would be defeated, the dead resurrected, and all creation purified. Yet until that final triumph, souls experienced the consequences of their deeds in these distinct realms. The imagery of the Chinvat Bridge resonated deeply with communities, shaping how they lived and how they mourned. Families remembered the dead with prayers, reciting passages from the Avesta to strengthen the soul on its journey. Festivals of remembrance, such as those held in honour of the Fravashis, the guardian spirits of the departed, reinforced the bond between the living and the dead. The belief that souls lingered near the living in the early days after death encouraged acts of devotion, charity and prayer on their behalf, ensuring that the community remained engaged in the fate of its members even after death. The rituals of mourning thus served not only to honour the deceased but to reaffirm the moral commitments of the living. The concept of judgment at death also shaped ethics in life. Knowing that every thought, word and deed would be weighed, believers were motivated to live truthfully, avoiding lies, deceit and impurity. The fear of falling from the bridge into darkness was balanced by the hope of entering the house of song, creating a moral framework that guided daily decisions. The integration of eschatology with ethics ensured that religion was not merely about rituals or festivals, but about the very conduct of life. This emphasis distinguished Zoroastrianism from many ancient religions that focused on ritual appeasement of gods, rather than ethical accountability. Comparisons with other traditions reveal both uniqueness and influence. The imagery of a bridge of judgment has parallels in later religions, appearing in Islamic tradition as the sirat, and in other contexts as pathways or rivers that souls must cross. The dualism of light and darkness, truth and lie, heaven and hell, influenced Jewish, Christian, and Islamic eschatology, contributing to their own doctrines of judgment and afterlife. Yet Zoroastrianism's emphasis on the immediate consequences of deeds, the role of truth in judgment, and the eventual renovation of creation remained distinctive, providing a coherent and hopeful vision that sustained communities across centuries. The doctrine of the afterlife also carried political implications. Kings and rulers were reminded that their deeds too would be judged, that power could not shield them from divine scrutiny. Inscriptions that boast of truthfulness and condemn lies reflect this awareness, presenting rulers as aligned with Asher and warning against the fate of those who deceived. The Chinvat Bridge thus functioned not only as a religious image but as a political metaphor, reinforcing the expectation that leaders must govern justly, lest they face ruin in the afterlife. For ordinary believers, the rituals surrounding death provided comfort and continuity. The recitation of prayers, the tending of fires, the protection of water and earth from pollution, and the remembrance of souls ensured that death did not sever bonds but transformed them. Families saw themselves as part of a continuum, linked to ancestors through Fravashis, and responsible for guiding future generations through example and devotion. The afterlife was not distant but present, woven into the daily consciousness of communities. The expectation of a final renovation added depth to these beliefs. Though souls experienced reward or punishment after death, the ultimate destiny of humanity and creation was renewal. A saviour figure, the Saoshayant, would appear at the end of time, leading the resurrection of the dead, the defeat of Angra-Mainyu, and the purification of the world through molten metal that would burn away lies and corruption. In this vision, even those who had fallen into the house of lies would eventually be restored, cleansed of deceit and reunited with creation. This eschatological hope balanced the severity of judgment with the promise of universal restoration, ensuring that death was not the final word but a passage in the larger story of cosmic struggle and triumph. The teachings on death and afterlife thus gave coherence to Zoroastrian life, linking daily ethics with cosmic destiny, personal choices with eternal consequences. The Chinvat Bridge stood as a vivid reminder that truth and lie were not abstractions, but realities that shaped both this world and the next. Through rituals of purity, prayers for the dead, and visions of judgment, Zoroastrians lived in constant awareness of their role in creation. Death was not an end but a revelation, the moment when the hidden became visible, when the truth of a life was unveiled, and when the soul's alignment with Asher or Druj determined its path. The conquest of the Achaemenid Empire by Alexander of Macedon in the late 4th century BCE marked one of the most disruptive turning points in the history of Zoroastrianism. For nearly 2 centuries, the faith had been closely bound to imperial power, its symbols and doctrines integrated into the ideology of kingship, its priests and temples supported by the state. With the fall of Persepolis in flames, the death of Darius III, and the collapse of centralized Persian rule, Zoroastrian institutions faced profound upheaval. What followed was not the disappearance of the faith, but its reconfiguration, as communities navigated the destruction of temples, the loss of royal patronage, and the influx of Hellenistic culture. The survival of Zoroastrianism through this period of crisis illustrates both its resilience and its adaptability, qualities that allowed it to endure long after the empire that had first elevated it to imperial ideology had vanished. Accounts of Alexander's conquest, preserved in Greek and later sources, describe the burning of Persepolis, the looting of treasures, and the dismantling of institutions that had been the pride of the Achaemenids. For Zoroastrians, this destruction was not only political but religious. Fire temples were desecrated, sacred flames extinguished, and priests displaced. The Avesta, which by tradition had been collected and codified under the Achaemenids, is said to have been scattered or destroyed, with only fragments preserved through oral transmission and hidden manuscripts. Later Zoroastrian sources, written in the Sasanian period, portray Alexander as the accursed, the destroyer of temples and scriptures, a figure whose legacy was remembered with bitterness for centuries. Whether all these accounts are literal, or partly shaped by memory and polemic, they testify to the trauma experienced by communities who saw their sacred order overturned. The loss of royal patronage was particularly significant. Under the Achaemenids, kings had proclaimed their devotion to Ahura Mazda in inscriptions, built temples and sponsored rituals. With Alexander's conquest, the link between kingship and Zoroastrianism was severed. The Macedonian rulers who succeeded him did not invoke Ahura Mazda in their proclamations, nor did they align their authority with Ashur. Instead, they brought with them Greek gods, rituals, and cultural forms. Temples to Greek deities were constructed, Hellenistic festivals celebrated, and Greek became the language of administration and culture. Zoroastrian communities thus found themselves without state support, surrounded by foreign practices, and forced to preserve their traditions without the institutional backing they had long relied upon. Yet the faith did not vanish, At the local level, families continued to maintain hearth fires, recite prayers, and observe purity laws. Priests, though displaced from imperial courts, continued to serve communities, preserving the Avesta through oral recitation. Fire temples, though some destroyed, were rebuilt in smaller and more modest forms. The resilience of household devotion ensured that Zoroastrianism endured even in the absence of empire. In this sense, the period after Alexander revealed the depth of the faith's roots, showing that it was not merely a religion of kings, but a way of life sustained by ordinary people. The Hellenistic rulers who inherited Alexander's empire, particularly the Seleucids, faced the challenge of governing a diverse population that included Persians, Babylonians, Greeks, and many others. Their policies towards Zoroastrianism appear to have been pragmatic rather than uniformly hostile. While they promoted Greek culture and religion, they also recognized the importance of accommodating local traditions to maintain stability. Evidence suggests that some fire temples continued to operate, that priests retained roles in communities, and that Zoroastrian rituals were practiced openly. The Seleucid kings minted coins with imagery that blended Greek and Persian symbols, reflecting a policy of cultural fusion rather than outright suppression. For Zoroastrianism, this meant both opportunities and challenges. Survival was possible, but adaptation was required. One of the most significant adaptations was the incorporation of Hellenistic artistic and cultural forms into Zoroastrian expression. Inscriptions, reliefs, and architecture from this period show a blending of Greek styles with traditional Persian motifs. Temples combined Greek columns with Persian fire altars, and deities were sometimes represented with iconography influenced by Greek art. This syncretism did not mean abandonment of Zoroastrian beliefs, but reflected the pragmatic adaptation of forms to new cultural contexts. By adopting certain external features while preserving core doctrines, Zoroastrian communities ensured their continuity in a world dominated by Greek culture. The intellectual interaction between Zoroastrianism and Hellenistic philosophy is more difficult to trace but equally important. Greek writers, encountering Persian priests, incorporated aspects of Zoroastrian teaching into their own systems of thought. The concept of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, the dualism of light and darkness, and the idea of a final judgment appear in Greek philosophical texts of the period, suggesting a cross-pollination of ideas. Conversely, Zoroastrian theologians were exposed to Greek philosophy, astronomy, and cosmology, which may have influenced later developments in their own thought. The result was not a dilution of the faith, but a dynamic exchange that enriched both traditions. The memory of Alexander remained bitter in Zoroastrian tradition. Middle Persian texts composed centuries later, such as the Bundahishn and the Denkard, recount the destruction of the Avesta and the scattering of priests, blaming Alexander for centuries of decline. These accounts reflect both historical trauma and the need to explain the challenges faced during the Hellenistic period. By casting Alexander as the ultimate enemy of the faith, Zoroastrian authors reinforced the narrative of resilience. Even in the face of such devastation, the truth of Ahura Mazda endured. This memory also provided a framework for later encounters with foreign conquerors, reinforcing the conviction that no matter how destructive outsiders might be, the faith would survive. Despite the disruptions, the Hellenistic period also prepared the ground for Zoroastrianism's revival under later Iranian dynasties. The persistence of local communities, the adaptation of rituals, and the preservation of the Avesta ensured that when Iranian rulers regained power under the Parthians and later the Sasanians, they could draw upon an existing foundation. The survival of priests and the continuity of oral tradition were particularly crucial. Though texts may have been lost, the memorized recitations of priests preserved the core of the faith, ready to be reorganized and codified when circumstances allowed. The interaction between Zoroastrianism and Judaism during this period is another significant development. With the return of Jewish exiles under Cyrus and their continued presence under Persian and later Hellenistic rule, exchanges of ideas were inevitable. Concepts of angels, demons, resurrection, and final judgment that appear in Jewish texts of the Second Temple period bear striking resemblance to Zoroastrian teachings. While these influences began earlier, under the Achaemenids, they continued and perhaps deepened during the Hellenistic era, as both communities adapted to the challenges of foreign domination. These exchanges contributed to the shaping of Western religious thought, extending Zoroastrian influence far beyond its immediate context. The resilience of Zoroastrianism during the Hellenistic period demonstrates the strength of a faith grounded not only in imperial structures, but in personal devotion and communal identity. Even as temples burned and empires fell, families recited prayers, priests tended flames, and communities observed purity. The Chinvat Bridge still loomed in the imagination of believers, the Amesha Spenters were still invoked, and Ahura Mazda remained the supreme creator. The continuity of these practices ensured that when the political tides shifted, the faith would emerge intact, ready to reassert itself under new rulers. Thus, the era of Alexander and the Seleucids, though remembered with bitterness, was not a time of extinction but of survival and adaptation. Zoroastrianism learned to exist without imperial patronage, to adapt to foreign culture, and to preserve its core in the face of disruption. These lessons would prove invaluable in later centuries, when new empires and new conquerors would again challenge the resilience of the faith. Through the trials of the Hellenistic period, Zoroastrianism demonstrated that it was not merely the religion of kings, but a living tradition sustained by the devotion of communities, carried forward by memory, ritual, and the unyielding conviction that truth would ultimately triumph over the lie. When the Seleucid dynasty weakened and Iranian rulers reasserted control under the Parthians in the mid-3rd century BCE, Zoroastrianism entered a new phase of survival and revival. The trauma of Alexander's conquest and the long Hellenistic domination had left the religion fragmented, its temples disrupted, its priesthood dispersed, and its texts largely reliant on oral preservation. Yet the Parthians, though often portrayed as less centralized and less ceremonially grand than the Achaemenids before them or the Sasanians after them, provided conditions in which Zoroastrian communities could stabilize and gradually regain confidence. Out of this environment of gradual restoration emerged the Sasanian dynasty in the 3rd century CE, which elevated Zoroastrianism to an unprecedented level of centralization and orthodoxy, forging a powerful union of throne and temple that would define Iranian identity for centuries. The Parthians ruled a vast and diverse empire that stretched from Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau, encompassing peoples with long traditions of their own: Greeks in former Seleucid cities, Babylonians, Armenians, and nomadic tribes of Central Asia. In this pluralistic environment, Parthian kings did not impose a rigid religious orthodoxy. Instead, they practiced tolerance, allowing multiple cults to flourish while seeking legitimacy through Iranian traditions. For Zoroastrians, this meant space to rebuild temples, reconstitute priestly lines, and re-establish rituals disrupted during Hellenistic rule. Archaeological evidence from this era, including fire altars and inscriptions, demonstrates the continuity of Zoroastrian practices, even if in decentralized and regional forms. Priests regained importance as custodians of ritual, but under the Parthians their authority was localized. Unlike the later Sasanian period, there was no single central hierarchy controlling all fire temples. Instead, communities organized their own priests who preserved oral recitations of the Avesta, tended fires, and oversaw purity laws. These priests operated in rural villages, towns, and noble households, linking daily life once again to the cosmic struggle between Asher and Druj. The decentralization, though it limited uniformity, also ensured resilience. With no single institution to target, the faith survived in scattered but persistent communities, preserving core traditions even when political power shifted. The Parthian kings themselves employed Zoroastrian imagery to bolster their rule. Coins struck under Parthian rulers often depicted fire altars, a clear reference to the central ritual of the faith. Royal inscriptions invoked deities familiar from the Avesta, presenting kings as protectors of truth and order. The association of kingship with Zoroastrian symbols, though less explicit than under the Achaemenids, nonetheless reinforced continuity between dynasty and faith. By linking their authority with the sacred flame, Parthian rulers signalled that they were defenders of Iranian tradition, even as they governed a cosmopolitan empire. One of the most important developments of the Parthian period was the survival and gradual recollection of sacred texts. Oral recitation remained the backbone of transmission, but some effort was made to commit portions of the Avesta to writing. Middle Persian translations and commentaries began to circulate, allowing communities to understand the archaic hymns of the Gathas and the wider Avesta. These texts were not yet fully systematized, but the groundwork was laid for the more comprehensive codification that would take place under the Sasanians. The preservation of the Avesta across centuries of upheaval testifies to the dedication of priests and lay believers alike, who regarded accurate recitation as a sacred duty. Zoroastrian communities under the Parthians also displayed adaptability. In multicultural cities like Ctesiphon, they coexisted with Greeks, Jews, Christians, and other groups. Purity laws and distinct rituals preserved their identity, while shared spaces and commercial interactions fostered mutual influence. The presence of multiple traditions in close proximity may have sharpened Zoroastrian self-definition. encouraging priests to emphasize core doctrines and to teach them with renewed vigour. The memory of Alexander's conquest, preserved in Middle Persian traditions, reinforced the need for vigilance and continuity, ensuring that foreign cultural dominance would not again erase the foundations of the faith. By the early 3rd century CE, however, the Parthian dynasty faced decline. Internal divisions, external pressures from Rome, and the rise of local powers weakened its grip. Out of this instability emerged the Sasanian dynasty, founded by Ardashir I around 224 CE. Ardashir, originally a ruler of Persis, presented himself not merely as a political challenger to the Parthians, but as a restorer of Iranian tradition, closely aligning himself with Zoroastrianism. His rise marked the beginning of a new era in which religion and state would become more tightly bound than ever before. Ardashir's inscriptions make clear his devotion to Ahura Mazda. At Nakshi Rustam, he is depicted receiving the royal diadem directly from the god, a visual declaration that kingship was not merely hereditary or military but divinely ordained. By aligning his rule so explicitly with Zoroastrianism, Ardashir set the tone for his dynasty. The Sasanians elevated Zoroastrianism to the status of state religion, organising its priesthood, codifying its texts, and embedding its doctrines in the ideology of empire. This transformation turned what had been a decentralised community faith into a centralised institution intertwined with the machinery of governance. Under the Sasanians, the Magi regained prominence, but now within a structured hierarchy. A high priest, or Mabeden Maubed, presided over the priesthood, with authority extending across the empire. Fire temples were classified and organised, with Atash Behrams consecrated as the highest grade of sacred fire. Rituals were standardised, texts collected and edited, and theological debates guided by central authority. The close alliance between throne and altar gave priests immense influence, but also made them instruments of state ideology. Their role was not only spiritual but political, legitimising kingship, enforcing orthodoxy, and shaping the identity of the empire. The codification of the Avesta reached its most complete form under the Sasanians. Priests collected hymns, liturgies, laws, and myths into a structured corpus, with Middle Persian commentaries known as the Zend explaining archaic passages. Texts such as the Vendidad, with its detailed purity laws, were preserved and enforced, while cosmological and eschatological doctrines were clarified. The Denkard, though compiled later, reflects the Sasanian effort to systematize theology, presenting Zoroastrianism as a coherent body of doctrine capable of guiding law, governance, and daily life. This systematization ensured continuity and provided the faith with a clear identity in contrast to the growing presence of Christianity, Judaism, and later Islam. The Sasanians also wove Zoroastrianism into imperial ideology. Kings portrayed themselves as defenders of Asher, guardians of fire, and warriors against Druj. Inscriptions, coins, and reliefs consistently invoked Ahura Mazda, presenting the dynasty as chosen by the wise lord. Royal ceremonies included elaborate rituals at fire temples, public demonstrations of devotion that reinforced the unity of throne and altar. By making Zoroastrianism the religion of empire, the Sasanians ensured that loyalty to the king was also expressed as loyalty to the faith, binding political and religious identity into one. The revival under the Parthians and the rise of the Sasanians thus represents a two-stage process: first survival and gradual restoration, then centralization and elevation. Under the Parthians, Zoroastrianism endured as a decentralized but resilient tradition, preserved in households, villages, and local temples. Under the Sasanians, it became the ideological foundation of a powerful empire, codified, centralized, and enforced as orthodoxy. The trauma of Alexander's conquest was finally overcome, replaced by an era of confidence in which Zoroastrianism was not merely a community faith, but the defining identity of a state that saw itself as the guardian of truth against both internal corruption and external threats. The endurance of the faith through this transformation illustrates its adaptability and strength. In times of weakness, it survived through families and priests preserving prayers. In times of power, it expanded into a system of empire. The balance between continuity and change, between resilience in adversity and ambition in prosperity, ensured that Zoroastrianism remained central to Iranian identity for centuries, shaping not only religion but politics, culture, and the imagination of future generations. The worldview of Zoroastrianism was not only a religion of ethics and rituals, but also a comprehensive cosmology, a vision of the universe that explained creation, the forces that governed it, and the destiny toward which it moved. At its centre lay the conviction that the cosmos was the scene of a great conflict between light and darkness, truth and lie, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. This eternal struggle shaped not only the destiny of the world, but the daily life of every believer, for the choices of each individual contributed to the balance of this cosmic battle. Unlike traditions that saw the universe as the endless cycle of creation and destruction, or the arbitrary play of deities, Zoroastrian cosmology presented history as a linear process, moving toward a decisive end in which good would triumph and creation would be restored to perfection. According to Zoroastrian tradition, the universe began with the creation of two opposing realities. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, dwelt in a realm of pure light, truth and order, embodying all that was good and eternal. Opposed to him was Angra Mainyu, the hostile spirit, who existed in a realm of darkness and chaos, embodying deceit, corruption, and destruction. These two realities were separate at first, but the moment Angra Mainyu perceived creation, he attacked, seeking to mar and corrupt it. Ahura Mazda, foreseeing this conflict, created the world not only as a dwelling for humanity, but as the battlefield on which truth would eventually prevail. Time itself was understood as the arena of this struggle, a limited span in which evil was allowed to act, but destined to be defeated. The structure of time in Zoroastrian cosmology was divided into great epochs, often described in terms of millennia. In the first stage, creation was purely spiritual, perfect and untainted. In the second stage, material creation came into being, providing a realm in which humanity and the forces of good could act. Angra Mainyu's assault brought corruption, death, and disease, but Ahura Mazda had already prepared the plan of ultimate victory. The subsequent stages of history were the unfolding of this plan, the birth of Zarathustra, the spread of truth, the ongoing struggle of humanity, and the eventual arrival of a saviour who would bring about the final renovation. This linear conception of history distinguished Zoroastrianism from cyclical cosmologies, giving it a forward-looking orientation that influenced later religious traditions. The imagery of light and darkness was central to this cosmology. Light symbolized truth, knowledge, and life, while darkness symbolized ignorance, deceit, and destruction. Fire, as the most visible manifestation of light, became the focus of worship, reminding believers of Ahura Mazda's presence and the constant need to preserve purity. The sun, stars, and moon were also revered as manifestations of divine order, marking the rhythms of time and guiding human activity. Darkness, by contrast, was associated with secrecy, lies, and corruption, the domain of demons who sought to ensnare humanity. The dualism of light and darkness was not merely symbolic, but deeply embedded in the structure of reality, shaping rituals, ethics, and eschatology alike. The forces aligned with Ahura Mazda were the Amesha Spentus, the immortal benefactors who embodied aspects of creation and virtues. Vohu Mana represented good mind and compassion, Asha Vahishta, truth and order, Kshatra Vairya, just rule, Spenta Amaiti, devotion and humility, Harvatat, wholeness and health, and Ameritat, immortality. Together, they manifested Ahura Mazda's wisdom in the world, guiding humanity to live in harmony with Asher. Each Amesha Spenta had both a cosmic role and a moral dimension, linking natural elements with ethical values. Their presence illustrated the coherence of creation, where the physical and moral orders were inseparably connected. Against them stood the Devas and Drujas, demonic forces allied with Ahura Mazda. These beings embodied lies, violence, disease and corruption, attacking both body and soul. Their goal was to pervert creation, to spread falsehood, and to ensnare humanity in sin. Yet their power was not absolute. It was parasitic, feeding on the corruption of what was good. Rituals of purity, prayers, and acts of righteousness weakened their influence, while deceit, impurity, and violence strengthened them. This cosmic battle was therefore fought not only in the heavens, but in the daily choices of humanity, making every act of devotion a weapon in the struggle for truth. The human role in this cosmology was central. Unlike traditions that cast humanity as pawns of the gods or victims of fate, Zoroastrianism taught that human beings were allies of Ahura Mazda, participants in the struggle to defeat Ahura Mazda. Each person, through good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, contributed to the triumph of truth. The collective actions of humanity could strengthen the forces of light, weaken the forces of darkness, and hasten the final renovation. This moral responsibility gave human life immense significance, linking the smallest act to the largest cosmic battle. The dignity of humanity lay in this responsibility, for by choosing truth, people participated in the destiny of the universe itself. The cosmological myths preserved in the Avesta and later Middle Persian texts provided vivid narratives of this struggle. Stories of primordial creation describe how Ahura Mazda formed the sky, waters, earth, plants, animals, and humanity, each attacked by Ahura Mazda but preserved through divine protection. The first man, Gayamat, was slain by evil forces, but from his body sprang metals and from his seed the human race, illustrating how life emerged even from death under the plan of Ahura Mazda. The sacred bull, also slain, gave rise to all beneficial animals and plants, ensuring that creation was renewed despite corruption. These myths reinforced the conviction that even in apparent defeat, creation carried within itself the seeds of victory. The expectation of a final renovation, or frashokareti, gave this cosmology its ultimate shape. At the end of time, a saviour figure, the Saoshyant, would appear, born of Zarathustra's seed preserved in the waters. He would lead humanity in the final battle against Ahura Mazda, resurrect the dead, and preside over the purification of the world. A river of molten metal would flow across the earth, burning away corruption but leaving the righteous unharmed, cleansing creation of all impurity. Ahura Mazda and his demons would be defeated, and the world would be restored to its original perfection, free of death, disease, and falsehood. Humanity would live in eternal harmony with Ahura Mazda, enjoying immortality, wholeness, and truth. This eschatological vision gave hope to believers, assuring them that their struggles and sacrifices were not in vain, but part of a cosmic plan that would end in triumph. The cosmology of Zoroastrianism also shaped its rituals and laws. Purity codes were not arbitrary, but expressions of the cosmic battle, guarding creation against the spread of Druj. The tending of fire was a defense of light against darkness. The protection of water, earth, and air was a way of preserving creation against corruption. Every ritual act, from reciting prayers to maintaining cleanliness, was a microcosmic enactment of the larger struggle. By aligning daily life with cosmic order, believers contributed directly to the victory of light. This integration of cosmology with practice ensured that the faith was not confined to abstract speculation, but lived in tangible ways. The imagery of the eternal battle also influenced other traditions. Jewish apocalyptic literature, emerging in the centuries after the Achaemenid and Hellenistic periods, reflects striking parallels. The struggle between angels and demons, the expectation of a saviour, the resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment. Christian and Islamic teachings on heaven and hell, resurrection and the defeat of Satan likewise bear the imprint of Zoroastrian cosmology. Though these traditions developed independently, the contact between cultures ensured that Zoroastrian ideas left their mark on the religious imagination of the broader world. The battle of light and darkness thus extended far beyond the borders of Iran, shaping concepts of good and evil across civilizations. For Zoroastrian communities themselves, this cosmology provided meaning in times of adversity. Conquests, persecutions, and dispersions could be interpreted as episodes in the cosmic struggle, temporary triumphs of darkness destined to be overturned. The belief in a final victory gave strength to endure, while the conviction that every act of truth contributed to the outcome empowered individuals. The light of the sacred flame burning in temples and households was a constant reminder that even in the darkest times, the presence of Ahura Mazda endured, guiding creation toward its destined renewal. The vision of an eternal battle between light and darkness gave coherence to every aspect of Zoroastrian life. It explained the origin of the world, the presence of suffering, the demands of ethics, the necessity of ritual, and the destiny of creation. It linked the smallest detail of daily conduct with the largest cosmic plan, uniting theology, morality, and practice into a single worldview. Through this cosmology, Zoroastrians understood themselves not as isolated individuals, but as participants in a universal drama, their lives woven into the fate of the cosmos itself. When the Sasanian dynasty established itself in the 3rd century of the Common Era, it sought not only to replace the Parthians politically, but also to present itself as the divinely chosen guardian of truth, order, and Iranian identity. Nowhere was this more visible than in the relationship between kingship, law, and religion. The Sasanians forged a political system in which the authority of the monarch was inseparably bound to the will of Ahura Mazda, mediated by the priesthood and expressed through the application of law. Kingship in this context was not merely a matter of lineage or conquest, but of divine mandate, a sacred trust that carried immense responsibilities for justice, purity, and the preservation of creation. By integrating Zoroastrian theology into the fabric of governance, the Sasanians created one of the most theocratic systems of the ancient world, where throne and altar were united in a common vision of cosmic order. The inscriptions of early Sasanian kings make this integration clear. Ardashir-Tharfeters, founder of the dynasty, depicted himself at Nakshi Rustam, receiving the royal diadem directly from Ahura Mazda, a powerful image that declared his kingship divinely sanctioned. The relief shows Ardashir on horseback opposite the god, each extending a hand toward the other, while beneath their horses lie defeated enemies, symbols of falsehood crushed by truth. This imagery was more than artistic convention, it was a political theology. To rule was to act as the agent of Ahura Mazda, defending Ashur against Druj, justice against deceit, purity against corruption. By adopting such imagery, Ardashir established a model that his successors would follow, embedding divine sanction into the very presentation of monarchy. The role of kings as guardians of law was central to this model. Zoroastrian law, preserved in texts such as the Vendidad and expanded through Sasanian commentaries, covered not only ritual purity but civil and criminal matters. Kings were expected to uphold these laws, appoint judges from among the priesthood, and ensure that justice reflected divine truth. Court cases were not mere human disputes, but moments of cosmic significance, where the choice between truth and lie was at stake. To render a false judgment was to strengthen Achaemenid. To judge rightly was to align society with Ahura Mazda. The close partnership between kings and priests ensured that law was administered as both civic order and religious duty. The Sasanian legal system reflected this integration. Cases of inheritance, marriage, property, and contracts were adjudicated according to principles derived from Zoroastrian texts and priestly interpretation. Oaths were particularly significant as they invoked Ahura Mazda as witness, making false swearing not only a social offence but a cosmic betrayal. Punishments for perjury, deceit, and ritual pollution were severe, reflecting the belief that such acts threatened not only individuals but the very fabric of creation. At the same time, laws promoted social stability by protecting families, regulating commerce, and safeguarding communities. The result was a legal culture that combined practical governance with theological depth, binding the empire together through shared moral principles. Kingship also carried ritual responsibilities. Monarchs were expected to participate in ceremonies at fire temples, offering sacrifices and reciting prayers that affirmed their role as defenders of creation. Festivals such as Nowruz became occasions for royal display of piety, when kings presided over rituals that symbolized the renewal of cosmic order. Coins issued under Sasanian rulers consistently depicted fire altars, reinforcing the image of kingship tied to the sacred flame. These coins circulated across the empire, spreading the message that the ruler was not merely a political figure but a servant of the divine, entrusted with the preservation of truth. The alliance between throne and altar was institutionalized through the priesthood, particularly under the leadership of the Mobadan Mobad, the chief priest who served as advisor to the king. This figure held immense authority, shaping doctrine, overseeing ritual, and influencing policy. The partnership was symbiotic. The king provided protection and resources to the priesthood, while the priests legitimized the king's rule and enforced orthodoxy. This integration ensured unity, but also created tensions, as conflicts occasionally arose between royal ambition and priestly authority. Nevertheless, the system as a whole functioned to reinforce the perception that Sasanian kingship was inseparable from Zoroastrian truth. The ideological dimension of kingship extended into foreign policy. Wars against Rome, Byzantium, and nomadic peoples were cast not only as struggles for territory, but as battles between truth and falsehood. In inscriptions and propaganda, enemies were depicted as liars and corrupt, while Persian kings presented themselves as defenders of justice and purity. This framing provided moral justification for conquest and resistance, embedding Zoroastrian dualism into international relations. The empire's conflicts were thus not merely political contests, but episodes in the cosmic struggle between light and darkness. The Sasanian emphasis on divine mandate also influenced succession. Legitimate heirs were presented as chosen by Ahura Mazda, their authority affirmed through rituals and proclamations. Usurpers, by contrast, were denounced as liars, their rebellion equated with Druj. This moralization of succession disputes strengthened the throne's stability, making loyalty not only a political obligation, but a religious duty. Even in times of internal conflict, the framework of divine kingship provided a language through which legitimacy could be contested and reasserted. Law under the Sasanians also regulated social and economic life, in ways that reflected Zoroastrian principles. Agriculture was encouraged and praised as participation in creation, while waste and neglect of the land were condemned as alignment with Druj. Trade was regulated to ensure honesty, with contracts enforced by oaths and punishments for deceit. Families were protected through laws of inheritance and marriage, reflecting the importance of household stability for the preservation of truth. Even dietary laws, shaped by purity codes, reflected the integration of daily life with cosmic order. These regulations created a society in which religion permeated every level, from imperial politics to the most ordinary transactions. The connection between kingship and divine mandate was also expressed in monumental architecture. The grand palaces of Ctesiphon, the reliefs of Nakshi Rostam, and the fire temples scattered across the empire all embodied the unity of political and religious authority. Reliefs depicted kings standing before fire altars, receiving investiture from Ahura Mazda, or triumphing over enemies with divine sanction. These images communicated to subjects and outsiders alike, that the empire was not a mere human construct, but a divinely guided order, sustained by the cooperation of king, priest and people. The theological justification of kingship was further elaborated in Sasanian literature. Middle Persian texts emphasize that kings were chosen by Ahura Mazda to protect creation, enforce justice, and uphold truth. Failure to do so brought disaster not only politically but cosmically, weakening the forces of good. This literature reinforced the sense of moral gravity surrounding kingship, making it clear that the throne was both a privilege and a burden. Kings were not above the law, but bound by it, accountable to the same cosmic order as their subjects. Their greatness lay in their service to truth, not in arbitrary power. Yet the close alliance of throne and altar also posed dangers. The concentration of religious authority under state control risked rigidity and suppression of dissent. The enforcement of orthodoxy limited theological diversity, and those who strayed from official doctrine faced persecution. Minority religions, particularly Christians and later Manichaeans, often experienced suspicion and repression, as their presence was seen as a challenge to the unity of truth upheld by the empire. These tensions reveal the costs of the Sasanian synthesis of kingship and religion, even as it provided cohesion and stability. Nevertheless, the legacy of this model was profound. The Sasanian fusion of kingship, law, and divine mandate influenced not only later Iranian dynasties but also the broader region. The concept of ruler as divinely chosen protector of truth resonated in Islamic political thought, just as the imagery of fire altars and divine investiture left lasting impressions on art and architecture. Even as the empire eventually fell to Arab conquest, the memory of Sasanian kingship as divinely sanctioned endured, shaping identities long after the dynasty itself had vanished. The Sasanian period thus represents the high point of Zoroastrian integration with state power. Kingship was sacralized, law was infused with theology, and empire was presented as the earthly reflection of cosmic order. The divine mandate of kings was not abstract but visible in rituals, coins, inscriptions and laws, making every aspect of governance a manifestation of Zoroastrian truth. In this system, throne and altar stood side by side, united in purpose, each reinforcing the other in the defense of Asher against Druj, light against darkness, truth against falsehood. The history of Zoroastrianism cannot be fully understood without considering its interaction with other religious traditions that grew alongside it or encountered it through empire, conquest, and cultural exchange. The lands over which Zoroastrianism held sway were never inhabited by one people alone. From the Achaemenid period onward, the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamian lowlands were home to Jews, Babylonians, Greeks, Syrians, Armenians, and later Christians, Manichaeans, and Buddhists. Each encounter left its mark, producing both conflict and cross-pollination. The Sasanian Empire, which raised Zoroastrianism to the height of state religion, governed millions who did not follow Ahura Mazda, requiring careful management of diversity, while earlier centuries of coexistence had already set the stage for significant exchanges of ideas. The encounter between Zoroastrianism and Judaism is among the most influential. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem, rebuild their temple, and re-establish their worship. This act, celebrated in Jewish tradition, established a bond between the Persians and the Jews. During the Achaemenid period, Judea remained under Persian rule, and Jewish communities lived within the empire, exposed to Zoroastrian ideas. The extent of influence is debated, but many scholars note striking parallels. Concepts such as angels and demons, resurrection of the dead, final judgment, heaven and hell, and the expectation of a saviour figure appear in Jewish writings of the Second Temple period, particularly in apocalyptic literature. These ideas bear resemblance to Zoroastrian eschatology, suggesting that the contact between the two faiths shaped the development of Jewish theology. For the Jews, Zoroastrian dualism may have provided new ways to articulate the conflict between good and evil, while Zoroastrian emphasis on resurrection and final renovation resonated with their own hopes for deliverance. By the time Christianity emerged, these ideas had already become part of Jewish thought, and their transmission into Christian theology further extended Zoroastrian influence. The Christian concepts of Satan as adversary, the battle between light and darkness, the resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment all bear the imprint of ideas familiar in Zoroastrian cosmology. While Christianity developed its doctrines independently, the long centuries of Jewish and Persian interaction ensured that Zoroastrian themes were part of the religious environment from which Christianity arose. In later centuries, as Christianity spread into the Sasanian Empire, these similarities and differences became sources of both connection and conflict. The presence of Christian communities within Sasanian territory presented unique challenges. Christianity had spread eastward from the Roman Empire, establishing communities in Mesopotamia, Armenia and Persia. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, these communities were numerous and organised, often with their own bishops, monasteries, and networks of communication with centres in Antioch and later Constantinople. For the Sasanian rulers, this posed a problem. Zoroastrianism was the state religion, central to the identity of the empire, while Christianity was associated with Rome, the rival and frequent enemy of Persia. Christians within Persia were sometimes suspected of disloyalty, their allegiance questioned because of their ties to a foreign power. The response varied over time. In some periods, Christians were tolerated, allowed to worship and maintain churches, provided they respected Zoroastrian law and did not proselytize aggressively. In other times, especially during wars with Rome, Christians were persecuted, their leaders executed, and their churches destroyed. Zoroastrian priests often pressed for stricter measures, seeing Christianity as a threat to religious unity and orthodoxy. Yet Christian communities endured, adapting to their environment, translating scriptures into Syriac and Middle Persian, and developing a distinct Persian Christianity known as the Church of the East. The persistence of these communities illustrates the pluralism of the Sasanian Empire, even under pressures of orthodoxy. The intellectual encounter between Zoroastrianism and Christianity produced fascinating exchanges. Christian theologians in Persia debated with Zoroastrian priests, comparing doctrines of resurrection, judgment, and divine justice. Some Christians saw parallels between the Zoroastrian expectation of the Saoshyant and their own anticipation of Christ's return, while others emphasized differences, particularly regarding the nature of God and the role of Christ. Zoroastrian critics accused Christians of undermining purity laws and worshipping a mortal man, while Christians criticized the elaborate rituals and legalism of the Magi. These debates sharpened identities, forcing each community to articulate its beliefs more clearly in contrast with the other. Another significant encounter was with Manichaeism, the religion founded in the 3rd century CE by the prophet Mani, who claimed to bring a universal faith that synthesized elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. Mani, born in Mesopotamia, grew up in an environment where these religions coexisted, and his teachings reflect this diversity. He adopted Zoroastrian dualism, presenting the universe as a struggle between light and darkness, but reinterpreted it in a way that emphasized the imprisonment of light within matter. His cosmology described a primal conflict in which light was trapped in the physical world, and salvation required liberating it through ascetic practice and knowledge. Mani's appropriation of Zoroastrian ideas was both a tribute and a provocation. He acknowledged Zarathustra as one of the great prophets, alongside Jesus and the Buddha, but claimed to surpass them with a final revelation. This claim challenged the authority of the Zoroastrian priesthood, particularly under the Sasanians, who had elevated Zoroastrianism to state religion. The Magi denounced Manichaeism as heresy, and the Sasanian kings, closely allied with the priests, persecuted its adherents. Mani himself was imprisoned and executed under Bahram III, and his followers often faced harsh repression. Yet the appeal of Manichaeism's universal message allowed it to spread far beyond Persia, reaching Central Asia, China, and the Roman Empire. The encounter between Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism thus illustrates how the ideas of the former could inspire new religious movements even as it sought to suppress them. The rivalry with Manichaeism also reinforced Zoroastrian identity. By condemning Mani's teachings, the priesthood clarified its own doctrines, emphasizing the unique role of Ahura Mazda, the centrality of ritual purity, and the authority of the Avesta. The conflict highlighted the dangers of syncretism from the perspective of the Sasanians, who saw in Manichaeism not a legitimate synthesis, but a distortion of truth. This encounter thus illustrates how external challenges often serve to sharpen internal coherence, forcing Zoroastrianism to define itself against competing visions of dualism and salvation. The presence of Judaism, Christianity, and Manichaeism within the Persian world demonstrates the pluralism of the region and the porous boundaries between traditions. Ideas moved across communities, sometimes adopted, sometimes resisted, always shaping religious development. Zoroastrianism provided a framework of dualism, eschatology, and moral responsibility that influenced its neighbours, while also absorbing elements from them in practice and interpretation. At the same time, its status as state religion under the Sasanians gave it power to suppress rivals, leading to cycles of tolerance and persecution that shaped the lives of millions. These encounters also reveal the broader significance of Zoroastrianism in the history of religions. It was not an isolated tradition, but a central participant in the religious ferment of the ancient and late antique world. Its ideas of cosmic struggle, final judgment, and resurrection influenced Judaism and Christianity. Its rituals and purity laws distinguished it from its neighbours. Its rivalry with Manichaeism helped shape the boundaries of orthodoxy. Through these interactions, Zoroastrianism left its mark far beyond the Iranian plateau, contributing to the religious vocabulary of the entire region. For the communities that lived under Sasanian rule, these interactions were part of daily life. A Jewish family in Babylon, a Christian bishop in Ctesiphon, a Manichaean ascetic in Mesopotamia, and a Zoroastrian priest in a fire temple all inhabited the same empire, each practicing their faith, debating their doctrines, and negotiating their place in society. The coexistence was not always peaceful, but it was always dynamic, producing a rich tapestry of belief that defined the spiritual landscape of late antiquity. When Arab armies swept into Persia in the mid-7th century, carrying with them the message of Islam and the political authority of the Rashidun, and later Umayyad caliphates, the Zoroastrian world faced one of the greatest turning points in its long history. The fall of the Sasanian dynasty was not merely the collapse of a political order, but the end of a system in which religion and state had been almost indistinguishable. For centuries, kings had ruled under the mandate of Ahura Mazda, fire temples had stood as symbols of state power, and the Magi had shaped both law and theology in partnership with the throne. With the defeat of Yazdegerd III and the incorporation of Persia into the growing Islamic Caliphate, this world disintegrated, forcing Zoroastrian communities to adapt, survive, and redefine themselves in radically altered circumstances. The conquest was swift but uneven. The decisive battles at Al-Qadisiyah in 636 and Nahavand in 642 shattered the Sasanian army, opening the Iranian plateau to Arab control. Cities surrendered, often negotiating terms that preserved life and property in exchange for tribute. In some places, resistance persisted, particularly in the mountainous regions and along the eastern frontiers, but the empire that had once rivaled Rome was soon absorbed into a new order. Fire temples were desecrated or converted, royal estates were confiscated, and the great administrative centres of Ctesiphon and Persepolis fell silent. Yet for all the disruption, the conquest did not annihilate Zoroastrianism overnight. Instead, it initiated a long process of transformation in which the faith endured as a minority religion, adapting to conditions of subordination while striving to preserve its identity. One of the immediate consequences was the loss of state support. Under the Sasanians, fire temples had been endowed with land, wealth, and royal patronage. Priests held positions of authority, adjudicated disputes, and shaped policy. With the arrival of Islamic rule, these privileges vanished. Temples were stripped of their resources, priests lost their political power, and communities found themselves dependent on local leadership and household devotion rather than imperial backing. The fall from state religion to tolerated minority was profound, reshaping every aspect of Zoroastrian life. Islamic rule introduced a new system of governance for religious minorities. Zoroastrians, like Jews and Christians, were classified as people of the book, afforded a protected but subordinate status as dhimmis. This status required payment of the jizya, a tax levied on non-Muslims, in exchange for the right to practice their faith, maintain their communities, and receive protection from the state. While this arrangement ensured survival, it also marked Zoroastrians as socially and economically disadvantaged. The burden of the jizya, combined with restrictions on public expression of their religion, gradually weakened their position, encouraging conversion to Islam among many who sought relief from these pressures. Despite these challenges, Zoroastrian communities persisted. Fire temples continued to operate in many places, particularly in rural areas and regions distant from centres of Arab control. Priests preserved the Avesta through oral recitation and manuscript copying, ensuring that the sacred texts were not lost. Families maintained household rituals, reciting prayers, observing purity laws, and celebrating festivals such as Nowruz. The very resilience of these practices testified to the depth of devotion which could survive even without state support or public prominence. The survival of Zoroastrianism in the centuries after the conquest illustrates the strength of a religion rooted not only in political structures but in daily life. The transformation of Zoroastrian communities under Islam also produced significant cultural exchanges. Arabic became the language of administration, scholarship, and much of daily life, and Zoroastrians, like other non-Muslims, gradually adopted it for commerce and communication. Middle Persian texts were translated, reinterpreted, and sometimes preserved in Arabic, ensuring their transmission even within a new cultural framework. At the same time, Islamic scholars encountered Zoroastrian doctrines, writing about them in works of theology and history. While often critical, these writings nonetheless preserved knowledge of Zoroastrian cosmology, law, and ritual that might otherwise have been lost. Conversion to Islam occurred gradually. Some conversions were motivated by genuine conviction, as individuals were drawn to the new faith's message of monotheism and community. Others were pragmatic, seeking relief from the jizya, access to political and economic opportunities, or escape from social stigma. Over time, especially in urban centres, Zoroastrian numbers declined as Islam became dominant. Yet in rural areas, particularly in Yazd and Kerman, Zoroastrian communities remained strong, preserving their traditions across centuries. The contrast between urban assimilation and rural resilience illustrates the varied responses to the challenges of Islamic rule. The memory of the conquest was preserved in Middle Persian literature composed during the early Islamic centuries. Texts such as the Denkard and the Bundahishan recount the decline of the Sasanians and the devastation of fire temples, casting the Arabs as agents of Angramainyu, the enemies of truth who destroyed the order of creation. These writings, though shaped by polemic, reveal the trauma experienced by communities who had seen their world overturned, yet they also emphasize endurance, portraying Zoroastrianism as a faith that, though battered, would ultimately survive until the final renovation. The preservation of such literature itself was an act of resistance, asserting identity in the face of subordination. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, Zoroastrians found both opportunities and challenges. The Abbasids, ruling from Baghdad, presided over a cosmopolitan empire where scholars, traders, and officials of many faiths interacted. Zoroastrians participated in this environment, contributing to science, medicine, and administration. Some entered government service, others engaged in trade, and still others participated in the vibrant intellectual life of the time. The transmission of Persian literature and learning into Arabic culture owed much to Zoroastrian scribes and scholars. Yet the pressures of assimilation continued, and conversions increased, particularly among elites seeking advancement. The Abbasid period thus illustrates both the integration and the gradual decline of Zoroastrian influence. One of the most significant transformations during this era was the migration of Zoroastrians to India, where they became known as the Parsis. According to tradition, a group of Zoroastrians fled from Iran in the 8th or 9th century, seeking refuge from persecution. They settled in Gujarat, where they were allowed to practice their faith openly, build fire temples and preserve their traditions. Over time, the Parsi became a prosperous and influential community, playing a crucial role in preserving Zoroastrian identity during centuries when it declined in Iran. Their migration ensured that the faith would not be confined to the margins of Iranian society, but would find new life in another land, influencing trade, culture, and eventually the modern revival of Zoroastrianism. The Islamic conquest also reshaped Zoroastrian theology. Living as a minority religion forced communities to reflect on their identity, reinterpret their doctrines, and articulate their differences from the dominant faith around them. Debates with Muslim scholars sharpened definitions of key concepts such as dualism, resurrection, and the nature of the divine. In some cases, Zoroastrians emphasized their monotheism, stressing the supremacy of Ahura Mazda in order to counter accusations of dualism or polytheism. In other cases, they defended their unique rituals and laws, presenting them as essential to preserving creation. The encounter with Islam thus stimulated theological reflection, even as it constrained public practice. The transformation of Zoroastrian communities under Islam was not uniform. In some regions, they remained relatively strong for centuries. In others, they dwindled rapidly. Political shifts, local conditions, and the attitudes of rulers all influenced their fate. Some caliphs were more tolerant, others more repressive. Some communities thrived in trade and scholarship, others suffered decline. Yet across these variations, the broader pattern was one of adaptation, resilience, and gradual diminishment in numbers. The faith that had once commanded empires survived as a minority, carried forward by the devotion of families, the dedication of priests, and the memory of a glorious past. The story of Zoroastrianism after the Islamic conquest is thus not one of extinction, but of transformation. From the ashes of the Sasanian state arose communities that redefined themselves in new conditions, preserving rituals, reciting prayers, copying texts, and celebrating festivals even in the face of adversity. The survival of Zoroastrianism into the present, both in Iran and among the Parsi of India, is testimony to the resilience forged during this era of profound change. The loss of empire was devastating, but the faith endured, carried by those who refused to let the sacred flame be extinguished. After the fall of the Sasanian dynasty and the consolidation of Islamic rule, Zoroastrianism entered a long era of diminished political influence but remarkable persistence. The transition from state religion to minority tradition forced its followers into new strategies of survival, balancing quiet resilience in Iran with the beginnings of a diaspora that would one day become vital to the preservation and revival of the faith. The dual story of endurance in Persia and renewal in India illustrates both the challenges of life under foreign dominance and the creative adaptations that ensured Zoroastrianism would never vanish. The sacred flame continued to burn, though often hidden, and the prayers of the Avesta continued to be recited, whispered in households, recited in fire temples, and carried across seas to new lands where communities could begin again. In Persia, survival meant adapting to the restrictions of life as dhimmis under Islamic rule. Communities were concentrated in regions where the state's presence was less overwhelming, particularly in Yazd and Kerman, where fire temples and priestly families endured across centuries. These enclaves became centres of continuity, where rituals of purity, daily prayers and festivals such as Nowruz Mergen, and Sade, continued to be observed despite pressures of taxation, discrimination, and occasional persecution. Zoroastrians were often barred from public office and faced social stigma, but within their own circles they preserved a world of ritual and memory, binding each generation to its ancestors and to Ahura Mazda. The priesthood played a crucial role in this persistence. Without imperial support, priests relied on local patronage, serving as guardians of fire temples, teachers of ritual, and custodians of oral tradition. They continued to transmit the Avesta through memorization and recitation, while Middle Persian texts such as the Bundahishn, Denkard, and Adaviraf Namag were composed to preserve theological, cosmological, and ethical teachings. These writings not only preserved memory of the past, but also offered guidance for living faithfully in the present, emphasizing endurance, purity, and hope for the eventual renovation of creation. The act of preserving texts itself became a form of resistance, a declaration that the truth of Zarathustra could not be erased by conquest. Communities maintained cohesion through rituals that sanctified daily life. Weddings, births, funerals, and seasonal festivals provided continuity and collective identity. The use of towers of silence for funerary exposure, though restricted in some places, persisted as a defining practice, symbolizing the refusal to abandon the purity laws that had always distinguished the faith. Households lit lamps and recited prayers at dawn and dusk, linking private life to cosmic truth. Through these acts, ordinary families became the true defenders of the religion, carrying it quietly through centuries when its public voice was diminished. Yet survival in Persia was not without cost. Numbers declined steadily, as conversion to Islam offered escape from social and economic burdens. The jizya tax pressed heavily on poor communities, and opportunities for advancement were limited to those who left the faith. Intermarriage and assimilation further eroded numbers, leaving Zoroastrians as a shrinking minority. By the medieval period, they were regarded by many Muslims as relics of the past, tolerated but marginalized, surviving in small, isolated enclaves. The faith that had once shaped empires became a whisper in its homeland, sustained by resilience rather than power. Amid this decline, however, a new chapter opened beyond Iran. According to tradition, sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries, a group of Zoroastrians left Persia by sea, seeking refuge in India. The reasons for this migration remain partly legendary, preserved in stories such as the Qissa-i Sanjan, a Persian epic poem written centuries later by the poet Bahman Kaikobad. According to this account, a group of faithful fled from their homeland to escape persecution, carrying with them the sacred flame and their treasured rituals. They landed on the western coast of India, in Gujarat, where they sought asylum from the local ruler. The legend recounts that the ruler, puzzled by the arrival of these strangers, tested their intentions by presenting them with a vessel filled to the brim with milk, symbolizing that his land was already full. In response, the Zoroastrians gently added sugar to the milk, demonstrating that they would not displace or overwhelm, but would sweeten and enrich the land by their presence. Impressed by their humility and wisdom, the ruler granted them land to settle, on the condition that they adopt the local language, wear Indian dress, and lay aside weapons while preserving their faith. Whether literal history or symbolic parable, the story captures the spirit of adaptation that defined the community's survival in India. In Gujarat, the exiles became known as Parsi, derived from the word for Persians. They established villages, built fire temples, and maintained their rituals with new vigour, relieved to practice openly without the restrictions they had faced in Iran. The sacred fire they brought, according to tradition, was enthroned in Sanjan and later moved to other sites as circumstances required, eventually residing in the Atash Behram in Udvada, which remains a central shrine of the Parsi community to this day. The preservation of the fire symbolized the continuity of tradition, linking the diaspora to the homeland and to the ancient vision of Zarathustra. Parsi communities thrived in their new environment. They adopted Gujarati as their language, blending into the fabric of Indian society while preserving distinct rituals, purity laws and festivals. Their reputation for honesty, industriousness and skill in trade earned them respect, and over time they prospered as merchants, artisans and landowners. Unlike in Iran, where they were marginalised, in India they carved out a place of dignity, their distinctiveness balanced by integration. The balance of adaptation and preservation became the hallmark of Parsi identity, ensuring that the faith could flourish in a foreign land without losing its essence. The survival of the faith in Persia and its rebirth in India were interconnected. Letters and visits between communities maintained ties, with priests and lay people exchanging knowledge, texts and encouragement. When Iranian Zoroastrians faced hardship, Parsis sometimes sent aid. When Parsi sought guidance on rituals or theology, they turned to their brethren in Yazd and Kerman. This trans-regional connection ensured that Zoroastrianism did not fracture entirely, but remained a single tradition spread across two centres, one in the ancestral homeland and one in the diaspora. The emergence of the Parsis also ensured that Zoroastrianism would play a role in global history. As trade networks expanded, Parsis became intermediaries between India, Persia and the wider world. Their openness to new opportunities, combined with their devotion to tradition, positioned them as a bridge between cultures. In later centuries, especially under British colonial rule, Parsis would rise to remarkable prominence, contributing to commerce, industry, education and philanthropy in India. But even in their earlier centuries, their presence ensured that Zoroastrianism survived not only in hidden enclaves, but in visible, vibrant communities shaping new societies. The endurance of Zoroastrianism in both Persia and India was a testimony to the faith's adaptability. In Iran, it persisted quietly, stripped of empire but sustained by ritual and memory. In India, it adapted boldly, integrating into new surroundings while preserving its identity. Together, these two paths ensured the survival of one of the world's oldest religions, linking the present to the ancient voice of Zarathustra. The sacred flame, carried through centuries of conquest and exile, burned on, illuminating the resilience of a community that refused to let its truth be extinguished. The survival of Zoroastrianism across centuries of political upheaval and cultural transformation depended not only on theology or scripture, but above all on the continuity of ritual. For Zoroastrians, ritual was not a symbolic gesture, but a literal act of aligning creation with truth, of strengthening Asher and resisting Druj. Every prayer spoken, every fire tended, every law of purity upheld contributed to the cosmic struggle. The practices developed in ancient Persia, refined under the Achaemenids and Sasanians, carried forward through the Islamic centuries and into the diaspora in India, forming a living chain of devotion that bound each generation to the next. Among the most visible and enduring elements of this ritual continuity were the fire temples, the towers of silence, and the ceremonies that sanctified daily and communal life. These practices ensured that even when numbers dwindled and communities were scattered, the faith remained embodied in acts that could be performed anywhere, from grand temples to modest homes. The fire temple was the heart of Zoroastrian worship. Fire, the most potent symbol of light and purity, embodied the presence of Ahura Mazda and the triumph of Asher. In temples across Persia and later India, sacred flames were enthroned in sanctuaries, tended by priests with meticulous care. Different grades of fire were consecrated, the most exalted being the Atash Behram, created through the ritual purification and unification of fires collected from diverse sources, including hearths, workshops, and natural flames such as lightning strikes. The process of consecrating such a fire could take years, involving elaborate ceremonies and countless recitations of the Avesta. Once enthroned, the flame was kept burning perpetually, fed only with pure wood and approached with ritual precision. The role of priests in these temples was not merely functional, but deeply symbolic. Their white garments and mouth veils signified purity and the protection of the flame from defilement. They recited prayers continuously, accompanying the tending of the fire with words that affirmed truth and resisted corruption. The temple itself was arranged to reflect cosmological principles, with the inner sanctum housing the flame accessible only to the priests, while lay people gathered in outer chambers to offer prayers and gaze upon the light. This structure emphasized both the transcendence of the divine and the accessibility of its presence through ritual. Even in small villages where temples were modest, the presence of a sacred fire provided a tangible link to the eternal struggle between light and darkness. In the diaspora, particularly among the Parsis in India, fire temples became the visible centres of community life. Cities such as Bombay, Surat and Navsari eventually hosted grand Atash Behrams, while smaller agyaris, or lesser fire temples, were established in towns and villages. The temples were not merely places of worship, but also institutions of education, charity, and social cohesion. Families visited to mark life events, festivals, and daily prayers, binding personal and communal identity to the sacred flame. The continuity of these temples, preserved and expanded across centuries, illustrates how ritual provided stability, even when theology or social circumstances changed. If the fire temple embodied the triumph of light, the Tower of Silence reflected the uncompromising commitment to purity. Zoroastrian funerary practice, rooted in the conviction that corpses are vehicles of corruption, forbade burial in earth or cremation in fire, lest the sacred elements be defiled. Instead, bodies were exposed in circular structures known as dakmas, or towers of silence, where vultures and the elements consumed the flesh, leaving bones that could later be collected in ossuaries. This practice, shocking to outsiders, was for Zoroastrians a profound act of fidelity to the principles of purity, ensuring that earth, fire, and water remained undefiled even in death. The rituals surrounding death were elaborate. Priests recited prayers beside the dying and the dead, guiding the soul in its 3-day journey toward the Chinvat Bridge, where deeds would be weighed. Families observed periods of purification, avoiding contamination while honouring the memory of the deceased. Ceremonies of remembrance, held at regular intervals, reinforced the bond between living and dead, invoking the Fravashis, or guardian spirits of ancestors. These rituals ensured that death did not sever ties but transformed them, embedding the departed within the cosmic order and the memory of the community. The towers themselves, often built on elevated ground, became visible symbols of the community's devotion to purity, stark reminders of the faith's distinctive vision of life, death, and the afterlife. The continuity of these practices required immense resilience. Under Islamic rule, exposure of the dead sometimes provoked criticism or restrictions, but Zoroastrians persisted, defending their traditions as essential to their identity. In India, the practice continued in Parsi communities, where towers of silence were built in cities and towns, often in secluded gardens. Even in modern times, when changes in urban environments and the decline of vulture populations created challenges, Zoroastrians debated passionately how to preserve the integrity of their funerary laws. The persistence of the dakma illustrates the depth of commitment to ritual continuity, even under the most difficult circumstances. Beyond fire temples and towers of silence, Zoroastrian ceremonial life encompassed a wide range of practices that sanctified daily existence. The recitation of prayers at dawn, noon, sunset and night marked the rhythm of the day, aligning individuals with cosmic order. The Kusti ritual, in which believers tied and untied a sacred cord around the waist while reciting prayers, symbolized the constant renewal of commitment to truth and the rejection of falsehood. Purity laws governed food preparation, personal hygiene and domestic order, making every act of life an occasion for devotion. Festivals such as Novruz, celebrated at the spring equinox, and Sadeh, marking the midwinter, linked communities to the cycles of nature and the triumph of light over darkness. Marriage ceremonies reflected this integration of ritual and life. Couples were joined not only in social contract but in sacred covenant, with fire as witness and prayers invoking fertility, harmony and devotion to Asher. The ceremony emphasized the responsibility of families to raise children in truth, linking the union to the cosmic struggle. Birth rituals likewise sanctified new life, welcoming the child into a community bound by purity and devotion. At every stage of life, Zoroastrian ceremonies wove individuals into the larger fabric of creation, ensuring that no moment was untouched by the presence of the divine. The continuity of ritual across centuries of exile, persecution, and diaspora reveals the central role of embodied practice in preserving the faith. Texts could be lost, political power could collapse, but as long as fires burned, prayers were recited, and funerals were conducted according to purity laws, Zoroastrianism endured. This emphasis on ritual gave the faith extraordinary resilience, allowing it to survive as a minority tradition and re-emerge in new contexts. It also gave the community a visible identity, marking it as distinct even among neighbours with whom they shared language, culture, or geography. In the diaspora, these rituals became the strongest link to the homeland. Parsis in India built temples modelled on those of Persia, maintained exposure practices, and celebrated the same festivals as their ancestors. By preserving ritual continuity, they ensured that their identity was not dissolved by distance or assimilation. Even when adopting new languages, clothing, and customs, they kept the sacred flame burning and the purity laws intact. The rituals thus became portable sanctuaries, carrying Persia into India, ensuring that the truth of Zarathustra remained alive in foreign soil. The strength of ritual continuity also shaped the imagination of later generations. For many Zoroastrians, the sight of a sacred fire, the recitation of prayers, or the rhythm of festivals evoked not only personal devotion, but the memory of centuries of endurance. Ritual was both an act of worship and an act of remembrance, a way of connecting with ancestors who had performed the same acts in distant times and places. In this sense, ritual was history embodied, a living archive of the community's survival. The persistence of fire temples, towers of silence, and ceremonial life demonstrates that Zoroastrianism survived not by withdrawing from the world, but by embedding itself in the daily actions of its followers. Each flame tended, each corpse exposed, each prayer whispered was a victory against oblivion, a declaration that the faith remained alive. Through ritual continuity, Zoroastrians carried their tradition across empires and oceans, sustaining one of the oldest religious legacies in the world. As Zoroastrianism endured the long centuries after the fall of the Sasanian Empire, surviving as a minority in Iran and flourishing in diaspora among the Parsis of India, its ideas continued to echo far beyond the boundaries of its communities. Though numbers dwindled and political power was lost, the philosophical foundations of the faith, its dualism of truth and lie, its linear view of history, its moral emphasis on human choice, and its vision of ultimate renewal, exerted influence on neighbouring religions, philosophical traditions, and cultural memory. In the modern world, these echoes can be heard not only in the rituals of Zoroastrian communities, but in the literature of Europe, the theology of Abrahamic faiths, and even the philosophical debates of modernity. The endurance of its philosophy demonstrates that while temples may fall and empires vanish, ideas have a power that transcends time. At the heart of Zoroastrian philosophy lies the conviction that existence is a moral battlefield. Unlike traditions that view human life as subject to fate or as insignificant within the vast cycles of the cosmos, Zoroastrianism insists that every person is endowed with dignity and responsibility, because each thought, word and deed tips the balance between Asher and Druj. This principle gave ancient Persians a framework in which ordinary life was infused with cosmic significance, but it also resonates strongly in modern philosophical discussions about freedom, responsibility, and the moral weight of human action. In a world often confronted with the problem of evil, Zoroastrian dualism offers a striking vision. Evil is not an illusion or a mere absence of good, but an active, hostile force that must be resisted through conscious choice. This insistence on responsibility has ensured the relevance of Zoroastrian ethics far beyond the bounds of its ritual observance. The linear vision of time and history, articulated by Zarathustra, also left an enduring legacy. In contrast to cyclical models of endless return, Zoroastrianism presented history as a meaningful story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Creation was brought forth with purpose, corrupted through the assault of Achaemenid, but destined for restoration through the Frashokoreti, the final renovation. This narrative not only gave hope to believers, but also shaped how later civilizations understood history itself. The Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions adopted linear models of creation, corruption, redemption, and final judgment, and many scholars see Zoroastrian influence in this transformation. The idea that history moves toward a decisive culmination, that humanity's struggles are part of a larger plan, and that ultimate justice will be achieved, has become a foundational element of much of Western religious and philosophical thought. Another profound echo of Zoroastrian philosophy is the doctrine of resurrection and final judgment. The Chinvat bridge, the weighing of deeds, and the expectation of a saviour who will renew the world, all provided models that resonate in Abrahamic eschatology. The Christian vision of the Last Judgment, with souls rewarded or condemned, bears clear parallels to Zoroastrian teachings, as does the Islamic Sirat bridge over hellfire. Jewish apocalyptic literature of the Second Temple period also reflects these themes, suggesting that Zoroastrian eschatology helped shape concepts that would later define monotheistic faiths worldwide. Even outside religious contexts, the idea of history, culminating in a decisive moment of transformation, has influenced modern philosophical and political thought, from utopian visions of social reform to revolutionary ideals of ultimate justice. The emphasis on truth as the supreme virtue also remains one of Zoroastrianism's enduring contributions. Asher, the principle of truth, order, and righteousness, was not an abstract ideal, but the very structure of reality. To live truthfully was to live in harmony with the cosmos. To lie was to side with destruction. This integration of ethics with ontology has fascinated modern philosophers, who see in Zoroastrianism an early articulation of the idea that morality is not subjective convention, but woven into the fabric of existence. The insistence that speech itself has moral weight, that words can strengthen or weaken creation, finds echoes in modern discussions about language, truth, and the social consequences of deception. In an age often marked by skepticism and relativism, Zoroastrian devotion to truth as the highest good speaks with renewed urgency. Cultural echoes of Zoroastrianism appear vividly in literature and art. In the 19th century, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche chose Zarathustra as the mouthpiece of his provocative work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Though Nietzsche's Zarathustra proclaimed doctrines radically opposed to the prophet's original message, the very choice of the name reflects the enduring fascination with the ancient sage as a symbol of wisdom and transformation. European Orientalists of the 18th and 19th centuries also celebrated Zoroastrianism as a noble and ancient religion, contrasting its rational ethics with what they saw as the superstition of other traditions. Poets and writers from Goethe to William Blake drew inspiration from Zoroastrian imagery of light, fire, and cosmic struggle, weaving it into their own artistic visions. In India, the Parsi became prominent cultural figures, carrying Zoroastrian identity into modernity with creativity and confidence. During the colonial and post-colonial eras, they distinguished themselves in commerce, industry, philanthropy, and education. Figures such as Dadabhai Naoroji, the first Indian to serve in the British Parliament, An industrialist like Jamsetji Tata exemplified the Parsi commitment to service, honesty, and progress. Their philanthropy built schools, hospitals, and cultural institutions, shaping modern India in profound ways. This visibility made Zoroastrianism far more prominent than its numbers would suggest, turning it into a cultural force recognised worldwide. Through the Parsis, Zoroastrian philosophy of duty, truth and service found modern expression in social action. The echoes of Zoroastrian cosmology can also be seen in modern science fiction and popular culture. The battle between light and darkness, the notion of a final renovation, and the idea of saviours who bring ultimate renewal appear in countless narratives, from novels to films. While often detached from their original religious context, these themes continue to resonate because they speak to universal human hopes and fears. The persistence of such imagery demonstrates how deeply Zoroastrian ideas have entered the collective imagination, shaping archetypes that endure across centuries. Within the modern Zoroastrian community itself, philosophy continues to guide identity in new contexts. Debates about ritual adaptation, intermarriage, and the role of women in priesthood reflect the ongoing effort to align ancient principles with contemporary life. The emphasis on good thoughts, good words, and good deeds remains the central moral compass, invoked in schools, temples, and community gatherings. The hope for eventual renovation continues to inspire resilience, reminding believers that even in times of decline or challenge, their efforts are part of a larger plan that will culminate in triumph. The philosophy of responsibility and hope thus remains a living force, shaping not only belief, but daily practice. Scholarly interest in Zoroastrian philosophy has also grown in recent centuries. Historians of religion recognize it as one of the earliest and most influential monotheistic or dualistic systems, while philosophers explore its implications for ethics, metaphysics, and eschatology. The rediscovery and translation of Avestan texts in the modern period brought its teachings to wider audiences, sparking debates about its role in shaping global religious traditions. For many scholars, Zoroastrianism stands as a reminder that profound philosophical ideas can emerge in diverse contexts, influencing civilizations far beyond their origins. The echoes of Zoroastrian philosophy are also visible in interfaith dialogue. In the modern era, Zoroastrians have engaged with other communities as partners in promoting tolerance, truth, and ethical living. Their emphasis on responsibility, care for creation, and respect for truth resonates with contemporary concerns about environmental stewardship, human rights, and global cooperation. By articulating their philosophy in modern terms, Zoroastrians contribute to conversations that transcend religious boundaries, offering wisdom drawn from millennia of reflection on the struggle between good and evil. Thus, Zoroastrian philosophy continues to live not only in the prayers of small communities, but in the broader culture of humanity. Its insistence on truth, its linear vision of history, its responsibility-centered ethics, and its hope for ultimate renewal have all left enduring marks on global thought. From the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity to the speculative works of European philosophers, from the philanthropy of Parsi in India to the popular myths of science fiction, the echoes of Zarathustra's vision resound. Though its numbers are few, its ideas remain powerful, a testimony to the enduring capacity of philosophy to outlive empires and to inspire across ages. The story of Zoroastrianism is not only the history of a people or a set of rituals, but the transmission of ideas, values, and cultural forms that have echoed far beyond the boundaries of its own communities. Though the number of Zoroastrians diminished dramatically after the Islamic conquest of Persia, the legacy of their faith can be traced across civilizations, carried in scriptures and traditions, in philosophies and symbols, in literature and art, and in the imagination of peoples who may never have met a follower of Zarathustra, but who nonetheless lived in worlds shaped by his vision. From the imperial courts of antiquity to the modern landscapes of science fiction and interfaith dialogue, Zoroastrianism has left marks that reveal the enduring power of its central convictions. One of the most profound legacies lies in the shaping of the Abrahamic religions. The contact between Jews and Persians during the Achaemenid era introduced concepts that profoundly influenced Jewish thought, and, through it, Christianity and Islam. The expectation of resurrection, the division of the afterlife into realms of reward and punishment, the judgment of souls, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil are ideas that bear the stamp of Zoroastrian theology. Jewish apocalyptic texts of the Second Temple period, Christian visions of the Last Judgment, and Islamic depictions of the Sirat Bridge all resonate with themes first articulated in Zarathustra's hymns and later elaborated in Avestan texts. The moral dualism that pits light against darkness, truth against lies, provided a language that shaped theological imagination across centuries. Even when later traditions diverged sharply from Zoroastrianism, the echo of its worldview remained embedded in their structures. Another legacy is found in the model of kingship articulated under the Achaemenids and perfected under the Sasanians, where rulers were depicted as chosen by the divine to uphold truth and order. This fusion of throne and altar influenced political theology across regions. The Byzantine emperors, the caliphs of Islam, and even medieval European kings articulated their legitimacy in ways that echo the Sasanian model of divine mandate. The imagery of investiture, where rulers receive authority directly from a god, can be traced from Persepolis reliefs to Christian coronation ceremonies. The idea that rulers must defend truth and justice, that their legitimacy depends on alignment with divine order, owes much to the Zoroastrian vision of kingship. Zoroastrian rituals and symbolism also left enduring cultural marks. The sacred flame, tended in fire temples for millennia, became a universal symbol of purity, illumination, and divine presence. Fire as a sacred element appears in countless traditions, but in Zoroastrianism it was systematized into a theology that influenced neighboring cultures. Festivals such as Nowruz, rooted in Zoroastrian cosmology and the rhythms of the seasons, remain widely celebrated today not only by Zoroastrians but by millions across Iran, Central Asia, and the diaspora. The continuity of these traditions demonstrates how rituals can transcend their original religious context to become part of broader cultural identity, shaping calendars, customs, and collective memory. The intellectual legacy of Zoroastrianism extended into philosophy and science. Greek thinkers such as Plato and Plutarch were fascinated by Persian dualism and incorporated elements of it into their own reflections on the nature of good and evil. Later, Neoplatonists engaged with Zoroastrian ideas through the Chaldean oracles and other sources, weaving them into mystical and cosmological systems. In the Islamic period, Persian scholars who were heirs to both Zoroastrian and Islamic traditions preserved and transmitted ancient sciences, blending them with new insights. Astronomy, medicine, and philosophy in the Islamic Golden Age carried traces of Zoroastrian cosmology, particularly in the emphasis on order, truth, and the intelligibility of the universe. Through these channels, Zoroastrian ideas influenced the development of global intellectual traditions long after the faith itself had become a minority. In the modern world, the most visible carriers of Zoroastrian legacy have been the Parsis of India. Their contributions to commerce, industry, education, and philanthropy during the colonial and post-colonial periods gave Zoroastrian values a prominent place in modern history. The Tata family, for example, built industries that transformed the Indian economy, while simultaneously funding schools, hospitals, and cultural institutions. Parsi philanthropists endowed universities, theatres, and charities, embodying the Zoroastrian ethic of service and responsibility. Their reputation for integrity and generosity became a cultural force, making Zoroastrianism visible far beyond its numbers. Through their actions, Parsis carried forward the ancient emphasis on good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, demonstrating its relevance in a modern world. Literature and art in Europe and beyond also preserved the fascination with Zoroastrianism. Romantic poets admired its imagery of light and purity, Orientalist scholars celebrated its antiquity, and philosophers like Nietzsche turned Zarathustra into a symbolic voice of transformation. Though Nietzsche's use of the prophet was ironic, the very choice of Zarathustra reflects the enduring association of the name with wisdom and moral weight. In modern literature and cinema, echoes of Zoroastrian cosmology appear in stories of cosmic battles between good and evil, in saviour figures who bring renewal, and in symbolic uses of fire and light. The persistence of these themes demonstrates how deeply Zoroastrian archetypes have entered the collective imagination of humanity. Even in Iran, where Zoroastrians became a small minority, their legacy continued to shape national identity. Persian poetry, from Ferdowsi's Shahnameh to modern works, drew heavily on pre-Islamic myths and imagery, preserving Zoroastrian cosmology in literary form. Heroes, kings, and cosmic battles described in these epics reflect the worldview of Zarathustra, transposed into national myth. Festivals such as Nowruz, though integrated into Islamic culture, retained their Zoroastrian roots, linking modern Iranians with their ancient heritage. The architecture of fire temples, the memory of Sasanian kings, and the stories of resilience passed through centuries all contributed to a cultural continuity that outlasted religious dominance. The legacy of Zoroastrianism also manifests in its role in interfaith dialogue and modern philosophy of religion. Scholars and believers alike recognize it as one of the earliest systems to grapple with the problem of evil, to articulate a coherent monotheism or dualism, and to propose a linear eschatology. Its emphasis on moral responsibility, truth, and care for creation speaks powerfully to modern concerns about environmental stewardship and global ethics. The image of humanity as co-worker with the divine in the preservation of the world has inspired both theological reflection and ecological activism. In this way, the Zoroastrian legacy continues to inform contemporary debates, even outside explicitly religious contexts. The endurance of its philosophy and rituals across civilizations demonstrates the paradox of Zoroastrian history. Though diminished in numbers, it has been immense in influence. It shaped empires in antiquity, inspired doctrines in major world religions, informed philosophies, influenced literature, and continues to speak to modern issues. Its legacy is not confined to museums or textbooks, but lives in the festivals people celebrate, the ethical principles they affirm, and the stories they tell of cosmic struggle and ultimate renewal. For Zoroastrians themselves, this legacy is both a source of pride and a responsibility. Communities in Iran, India, and the diaspora see themselves as custodians of an ancient truth that has shaped civilizations. Their rituals, prayers, and festivals are not only acts of devotion but affirmations of continuity, keeping alive a flame that has burned for thousands of years. The awareness of their heritage has also inspired efforts to preserve language, texts, and traditions in the face of modern challenges. In these efforts, the legacy of Zoroastrianism is not only historical but living, embodied in the devotion of those who still recite the Gaithas, tend sacred fires, and commit themselves to truth. Thus, the enduring legacy of Zoroastrianism across civilizations is a reminder that the influence of a faith cannot be measured solely by numbers or political power. Ideas, rituals, and values travel across borders, take root in new contexts, and shape the imagination of peoples far removed from their origins. The dualism of truth and lie, the vision of cosmic struggle, the hope of ultimate renewal, and the ethic of responsibility have all left indelible marks on human history. In the light of fire temples, in the verses of poets, in the doctrines of religions, and in the conscience of individuals striving for truth, the legacy of Zarathustra endures,